The sun hung low over the New Mexico territory like a copper coin dropped into a well of fire. Dust devils danced across the desert floor, and the air shimmered with heat so intense it made the distant mesas look like they were breathing. It was the kind of day when sensible folks stayed indoors, when rattlesnakes sought shade under rocks, and when outlaws planned their next move. Jesse Hawk Thornton crouched behind a boulder the size of a stagecoach, his keen gray eyes fixed on the trail below. At 26 years old, he'd already spent 8 years running from the law, and his face, handsome but hardened by sun and survival, had graced wanted posters from Kansas to California. The reward on his head had climbed to $3,000, a fortune that made every bounty hunter and ambitious lawman in the West dream of glory. His calloused hand rested on the grip of his Colt .45 Peacemaker, a weapon as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The gun had been manufactured in 1873 by Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company in Hartford, Connecticut, and it had saved his life more times than he could count. The weapon could fire 6 rounds of .45 long Colt ammunition, each bullet capable of stopping a man at 50 yards, or a charging horse if your aim was true. "Stage is late," muttered Tom Red-Eye McGraw, Jesse's partner and the only man he'd trusted since the war ended. Red-Eye was a mountain of a man, 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and beard, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite with a dull knife. He earned his nickname from a scar that ran through his right eye, leaving it permanently bloodshot and giving him a fearsome appearance that made strong men nervous. "Patience," Jesse whispered back. "Captain Reyes always runs the Santa Fe route at 3 o'clock regular as church bells. That Spanish gold from the mines in Colorado is worth waiting for." In the 1870s, stagecoach robbery was one of the most common crimes in the American West. The stagecoach lines transported everything from mail to payrolls to precious metals, making them prime targets for desperate men. Companies like Wells Fargo employed armed guards called shotgun messengers, the origin of the phrase riding shotgun, but even they couldn't stop determined outlaws in rough terrain. Jesse had planned this robbery for 3 weeks, studying the route, learning the schedule, finding the perfect ambush point where the trail narrowed between 2 walls of red rock. He'd chosen his crew carefully, just himself and Red-Eye. Smaller crews meant fewer people to split the take with, fewer people to make mistakes, and fewer people to betray you when the bounty on your head grew too tempting to resist. The sound of hoofbeats and creaking wheels echoed off the canyon walls. Jesse's pulse quickened, not from fear but from the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before action. He'd felt this same electric tension during the Civil War, when he'd ridden with Confederate guerrillas in Missouri, learning to shoot, to kill, and to survive in a world that had gone mad with violence. The war had ended in 1865, but for men like Jesse the fighting had never really stopped. The country had changed, the Union had won, slavery had been abolished and Reconstruction had begun. But the West remained a lawless frontier where the quickest gun and the strongest will determined who survived and who didn't. The Concord stagecoach rounded the bend, pulled by a team of 6 horses, likely Morgan or quarter horses, the most common breeds used for stagecoach teams because of their strength and endurance. The coach itself was a masterpiece of American craftsmanship, built by the Abbott Downing Company in Concord, New Hampshire. These coaches were suspended on leather thorough braces instead of metal springs, giving passengers a rocking motion that was easier on the body during long journeys across rough terrain. Jesse could see Captain Miguel Reyes on the driver's box, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. Next to him sat the shotgun messenger, a young man barely out of his teens, nervously clutching a double-barreled shotgun, probably a Remington model 1882, though it was hard to tell from this distance. "Now," Jesse said. He and Red-Eye stepped into the middle of the trail, both men with bandanas pulled up over their noses and their guns drawn. Jesse fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the Colt echoing like thunder in the narrow canyon. "Hold up that stage," Jesse shouted, his voice commanding and steady. "This is a robbery and nobody needs to die today." Captain Reyes pulled hard on the reins, and the horses snorted and stamped as they came to a halt. Dust billowed around the coach and for a moment, everything seemed frozen. The 2 outlaws, the driver, the messenger, the horses, all suspended in that terrible moment before violence either erupts or passes by. "Easy now," Jesse said, keeping his gun trained on the messenger. "Son, you put that shotgun down real gentle. I've seen too many boys like you die because they thought they were heroes. There's no shame in staying alive." The young messenger's hands were shaking so badly that the shotgun barrel rattled against the side of the coach. Jesse could see the terror in the boy's eyes, could see him trying to decide if his pride was worth dying for. "Do what he says, Tomas," Captain Reyes said quietly, his accented English calm and measured. The gold can be replaced. Your life cannot. The boy set down the shotgun and Jesse felt a wave of relief. He'd killed men before, during the war and after, but he took no pleasure in it. Each death weighed on his soul like a stone in a stream, smoothing him down, making him harder and colder with every passing year. Throw down the strongbox, Red-Eye growled, his voice like gravel being crushed under wagon wheels. Captain Reyes climbed down from the driver's box, moving slowly and deliberately. He was a dignified man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who'd seen much and survived more. He pulled a heavy iron strongbox from beneath the driver's seat and lowered it to the ground with a thud. That's when Jesse heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A soft gasp from inside the coach. His blood ran cold. "Passengers?" he asked sharply. "You carrying passengers, Captain?" Captain Reyes's face was impassive. "Just one, senor. A young woman traveling to Santa Fe." Jesse cursed under his breath. He'd been assured this run carried only cargo, no passengers, no complications. His informant had either been wrong or had lied, and now he had a witness who could identify him, describe his methods, testify against him in court. Red-Eye watched them, Jesse said, moving toward the coach door. His partner took up position with his gun trained on the driver and messenger while Jesse reached for the door handle. He pulled it open and time seemed to stop. Inside the coach sat the most beautiful woman Jesse had ever seen. She couldn't have been more than 23 or 24, with long auburn hair that fell in waves over her shoulders, skin the color of honey, and eyes like green glass that blazed with intelligence and anger. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, practical but well-made, suggesting she came from a family of some means, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, though Jesse could see they were trembling slightly. But it wasn't her beauty that stopped Jesse's heart. It was the fact that she didn't look away. Most people, when confronted by an armed outlaw, would avert their eyes, would cower or plead or cry. This woman stared straight at him with those green eyes, her chin raised defiantly, as if she were judging him and finding him wanting. "You planning to rob me too, Mr. Outlaw?" she asked, her voice sharp and clear as a bell. "Or do you only steal from institutions that can afford the loss?" Jesse found himself unable to speak for a moment. Her accent was educated Eastern, Boston or Philadelphia, he guessed, but there was no fear in her voice, only contempt. "What's your name?" he asked, and then immediately cursed himself for the question. Names meant connections and connections meant complications. "Eleanor Blackwood," she said, lifting her chin even higher. "Miss Eleanor Blackwood, lately of Boston and currently employed as a schoolteacher in Santa Fe. And you, sir, are interfering with my ability to reach my students on time for the start of the term." Eleanor Blackwood. The name struck Jesse like a physical blow because he knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Eleanor Blackwood was the daughter of William Blackwood, one of the richest cattle barons in New Mexico, a man who owned 40,000 acres of ranch land and ran 20,000 head of cattle. More importantly, William Blackwood had connections to the territorial governor, to judges, to lawmen throughout the Southwest. And Jesse Thornton had just put a gun in his daughter's face. "Your father know you're out here teaching school?" Jesse asked, trying to recover his composure. "My father knows I do what I please," Eleanor replied coolly. "As I'm sure you do, Mr. Thornton." Jesse's blood turned to ice water. "How do you know my name?" For the first time, a small smile played at the corners of her lips. "Your wanted poster is hanging in every post office and sheriff's station from here to California. I've seen your face 100 times. The artist captured your eyes quite accurately. Actually, they have that same predatory alertness like a hawk watching for prey." She was clever, this Eleanor Blackwood. Dangerously clever. She'd given him her name to protect herself, knowing that if he harmed the daughter of William Blackwood, he'd have every lawman and bounty hunter in the West hunting him down. But she'd also revealed that she'd recognized him, which meant she was now a liability. "Hawk." Red-Eye's urgent voice cut through his thoughts. "We got company." Jesse spun around to see dust rising in the distance. Riders coming fast. At least 6 of them, maybe more. Someone had tipped off the law, or a patrol had spotted them, or pure bad luck had brought a posse down on them at the worst possible moment. "Time to ride." Red-Eye shouted, already moving toward their horses hidden behind the rocks. Jesse looked back at Eleanor Blackwood, and in that moment something passed between them, something electric and dangerous and completely unexpected. He saw in her eyes not just anger but curiosity. And beneath that, something that looked almost like admiration, though he knew that couldn't be right. "Remember this face, Miss Blackwood?" Jesse said quietly. "But remember also that I could have hurt you and didn't. That ought to count for something." "It counts for nothing," she replied, but her voice had softened just slightly. "You're still a thief and an outlaw." Jesse touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect he hadn't shown anyone in years, and then he was running, his boots kicking up dust as he sprinted for his horse. Red-Eye was already mounted, the strongbox secured to his saddle. Jesse vaulted onto his own horse, a magnificent bay gelding named Tempest, and dug his heels into the animal's flanks. They rode like demons were chasing them, which wasn't far from the truth. The posse's gunfire cracked behind them, bullets whining off rocks and kicking up geysers of dirt. Jesse and Red-Eye split up at a fork in the trail, a prearranged plan, and Jesse veered north toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, those blood of Christ peaks that turned red as blood in the setting sun. As he rode, pushing Tempest to the limits of the horse's endurance, Jesse couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor Blackwood's green eyes, her defiant voice, the way she'd faced him without fear. He'd met countless people during his years as an outlaw, victims, accomplices, lawmen, other criminals, but he'd never met anyone quite like her. He had no way of knowing that this encounter would change both of their lives forever. That their paths would cross again and again, drawn together by forces neither could understand or resist. That her love would save his soul, and his love would nearly destroy her. All he knew was that somewhere in the high desert of New Mexico, under a sky as blue as sapphires and as vast as eternity, Jesse Hawk Thornton had just met his destiny. And destiny, he would learn, was a far more dangerous opponent than any lawman's gun. Eleanor Blackwood sat in the sheriff's office in Santa Fe, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Around her, chaos reigned. Sheriff Thomas Wade, a barrel-chested man with a magnificent mustache and a reputation for toughness, was shouting orders to his deputies. Maps were being unrolled on his desk, showing the labyrinth of canyons and trails where outlaws could hide. Telegraph operators were sending messages to other towns, alerting them to watch for two men riding hard with a stolen strongbox full of Spanish gold. But Eleanor's mind was elsewhere. She kept seeing Jesse Thornton's eyes, gray as a winter storm, sharp and intelligent, with something in their depths that she couldn't quite name. Pain perhaps. Or regret. The eyes of a man who'd chosen his path but wasn't entirely comfortable walking it. "Miss Blackwood," Sheriff Wade said, turning his attention to her. "I need you to describe these men in as much detail as you can remember." Eleanor took a deep breath, composing herself. She'd been raised to be strong, to face adversity with grace and courage. Her father had taught her to ride and shoot alongside his ranch hands, treating her more like a son than a daughter because she'd been smart enough and tough enough to demand it. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 12, and she'd grown up in a world of men, learning to hold her own through wit and will. The leader was about 6 feet tall, she began, her voice steady. 25 or 26 years old, with gray eyes and dark hair. He wore a black hat, a leather vest over a gray shirt and black trousers. His boots were worn but well maintained. He carried a Colt Peacemaker on his right hip, worn low the way a man wears it when he expects to use it. His face was tanned and weathered, with a strong jawline and a small scar above his left eyebrow. His hands were calloused like he's done hard work, but his voice was educated. Midwestern accent, probably Missouri or Kansas. Sheriff Wade was writing furiously, his pen scratching across paper. "That's remarkably detailed, Miss Blackwood. Most folks can barely remember if an outlaw was tall or short." "I was raised to be observant, Sheriff," Eleanor replied. "My father always said that in the West, the details you notice might save your life someday." "And the second man?" "Larger, perhaps 6.5 feet tall, heavily built. Reddish-brown beard, scarred right eye that appeared bloodshot. He wore rougher clothing and his gun was a modified Remington revolver. He called the leader Hawk, which I recognized as Jesse Thornton's known alias." Sheriff Wade nodded grimly. "Thornton and his partner Thomas McGraw. They've been hitting stagecoaches throughout the territory for 2 years now. Smart, fast, and violent when they need to be. You're lucky they didn't hurt you, Miss Blackwood." "I didn't feel lucky, Sheriff. I felt furious." This was true. Eleanor had spent the entire ride into Santa Fe seething with anger, not just at the robbery itself, but at the whole situation that had led to it. She'd moved to New Mexico to escape the suffocating propriety of Boston, to make a difference in the world by teaching children on the frontier. She dreamed of adventure, of meaning, of a life beyond the drawing rooms and tea parties that had imprisoned her back east. But this? Being robbed at gunpoint by handsome outlaws with tragic eyes? This wasn't the adventure she'd imagined. It was chaos and danger and lawlessness, and it made her blood boil to think that men like Jesse Thornton could just take what they wanted and ride away, leaving others to deal with the consequences. Your father's been notified, Sheriff Wade said, shuffling some papers on his desk. He'll likely want to escort you back to the ranch. Absolutely not, Eleanor said firmly. I have a job to do, Sheriff. The schoolhouse in Santa Fe is expecting me, and those children need a teacher. I won't let a criminal scare me away from my purpose. Miss Blackwood, with all respect, Jesse Thornton is more than just a criminal. He's one of the most wanted men in the territory. If he knows your name, if he knows who your father is, then he knows that harming me would bring down more trouble than he can handle, Eleanor interrupted. Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but I'm staying in Santa Fe. My mind is made up. Sheriff Wade sighed, recognizing the stubborn determination in her eyes. He'd known William Blackwood for 20 years, and he could see the man's iron will reflected in his daughter's face. Very well. But I'm assigning a deputy to keep watch on the schoolhouse and your lodgings. No arguments. Eleanor nodded, accepting this compromise. She rose to leave, smoothing her dusty traveling dress and adjusting her hat. As she reached the door, the sheriff called out to her. Miss Blackwood? One more thing. In your observation of Thornton, did you notice anything else? Anything unusual? Eleanor paused, her hand on the doorknob. She thought about that moment when their eyes had met, the strange electricity that had passed between them, the way he'd touched his hat in a gesture of respect. He was courteous, she said finally, even gentle in his way. He made sure his partner didn't frighten me unnecessarily, and he could have taken my jewelry but didn't. It was unexpected. That's his way, Sheriff Wade said grimly. Thornton's got a code, or thinks he does. Never killed anyone who wasn't trying to kill him first, never robbed from folks who couldn't afford it, never harmed women or children. Some folks call him a gentleman outlaw, like he's some kind of romantic hero. But robbery is robbery, Miss Blackwood, and eventually that code of his will fail him. They always do. Eleanor left the sheriff's office and stepped out into the plaza of Santa Fe. The town was one of the oldest settlements in America, founded by Spanish colonists in 1610, 8 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. The architecture reflected this Spanish heritage, with adobe buildings painted in earth tones, wooden vigas protruding from walls, and a central plaza where people gathered to trade, gossip, and conduct business. Santa Fe in 1878 was a collision of cultures. Native Americans from nearby pueblos sold pottery and woven goods in the plaza. Mexican merchants offered spices and leather goods from south of the border. Anglo settlers from the east brought new ideas and technologies. Chinese immigrants who'd helped build the railroads operated laundries and restaurants. It was a melting pot of humanity, all trying to carve out lives in the harsh but beautiful landscape of New Mexico. Eleanor had fallen in love with Santa Fe the moment she'd arrived 3 months ago, coming ahead of the school term to find lodgings and prepare her classroom. The town felt alive in a way Boston never had, rawer, more honest, more real. Here, a person's worth was measured by their actions and character, not by their family name or social connections. Or so she'd thought. But now, walking through the plaza with her blue dress still dusty from the road, she felt eyes following her. Word had spread quickly, as it always did in frontier towns, that Eleanor Blackwood had been robbed by Jesse Thornton himself. People whispered behind their hands, speculating about what had happened, embellishing the story with each retelling. By the time Eleanor reached her lodgings, a small but comfortable room above a general store owned by a kindly widow named Mrs. Chin, the story had grown to include a dramatic confrontation, gunfire, and a narrow escape. Eleanor wanted to scream at the absurdity of it all. Mrs. Chin met her at the door, her weathered Chinese face creased with concern. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had the strength of someone who'd survived the impossible. The journey from Guangdong province to California during the gold rush, the backbreaking work on the railroads, the loss of her husband to a mining accident, and the prejudice that Chinese immigrants faced throughout the West. "Miss Eleanor," she exclaimed in her accented English. "You safe? I hear terrible things, terrible robbery." "I'm fine, Mrs. Chin," Eleanor assured her, climbing the stairs to her room. "Just tired and angry and ready for a hot bath and a good night's sleep." But sleep didn't come easily that night. Eleanor lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Santa Fe settling down for the evening, dogs barking in the distance, a drunk singing off-key in a nearby saloon, the wind rattling the wooden shutters. She kept replaying the robbery in her mind, analyzing every detail, trying to understand why Jesse Thornton had affected her so strongly. He was a criminal, a thief, a man who lived outside the law and took what he wanted through force and intimidation. She should despise him completely, wish for his capture and imprisonment, hoped that justice would be served swiftly and surely. But she couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, the unexpected gentleness in his voice when he told her nobody needed to die today, the way he'd touched his hat to her before riding away. There had been something noble in him, something honorable buried beneath the layers of hardness and violence. "You're being ridiculous," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "He's an outlaw and you're a schoolteacher. You live in different worlds." But even as she said it, Eleanor knew that their worlds had collided for a reason. The West was too big, the odds too long for their meeting to have been pure chance. Somewhere in the grand design of things, some invisible hand had pushed their paths together. And Eleanor had learned long ago that when destiny came knocking, you opened the door, no matter how dangerous what waited on the other side might be. 60 miles north of Santa Fe, hidden in a box canyon that could only be accessed through a narrow passage between towering rock walls, Jesse Thornton and Red-Eye McGraw counted their haul. The strongbox had contained $15,000 in Spanish gold coins, doubloons and pieces of 8 that dated back to colonial times when Spain had ruled this territory. The coins were beautiful, stamped with the royal seal of Spain, worn smooth by years of handling. Each piece of 8, a silver dollar, could be literally cut into 8 pieces called bits, which was why Americans still referred to a quarter as 2 bits. The gold doubloons were worth substantially more, each coin containing about an ounce of pure gold. "That's 7,500 apiece," Red-Eye said, his scarred face split by a rare smile. "Enough to live like kings for a year, maybe 2 if we're careful." But Jesse wasn't smiling. He sat on a flat rock, staring at his share of the coins without really seeing them. His mind was still back in that stagecoach, looking into Eleanor Blackwood's defiant green eyes, hearing her sharp voice calling him out for what he was. "You thinking about that woman?" Red-Eye said. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking we got lucky," Jesse replied. "If she'd panicked, if she'd screamed or fought, that young messenger might have done something stupid. People could have died. But they didn't. Because you were smart like always." Red-Eye poured himself a tin cup of whiskey from their supplies, rough rotgut that burned like fire going down but helped take the edge off after a job. "So why you looking like someone shot your dog?" Jesse was quiet for a long moment, listening to the wind howl through the canyon. This hideout had served them well for 2 years, ever since they discovered it while running from a posse. It had water from a small spring, shelter from the elements, and most importantly only one way in or out, easy to defend, impossible to surround. The canyon walls were covered with ancient petroglyphs carved by Native Americans hundreds or even thousands of years ago, geometric patterns, spirals, handprints, animals both real and mythical. Jesse often wondered about the people who'd made these drawings, what their lives had been like, what they believed, whether they'd been happy or sad or just trying to survive like everyone else. "I'm tired, Red-Eye," Jesse said finally. "Tired of running, tired of stealing, tired of sleeping with one eye open and one hand on my gun. We've been doing this for 8 years, since the war ended, and what do we have to show for it? Some gold coins that we'll spend or lose, a string of enemies from here to the Pacific, and wanted posters with our faces on them." Red-Eye studied his partner carefully. They'd met during the war, 2 young men fighting for a cause they barely understood, watching their friends die in muddy fields and burning towns. After the war, when the world had changed and left them behind, they'd turned to outlawry because it was the only life they knew, the only thing they were good at. But Red-Eye had always known this day would come, the day when Jesse's conscience caught up with his survival instincts. Jesse had never been a natural outlaw. He was too smart, too thoughtful, too burdened by the weight of his choices. Red-Eye, on the other hand, had been born for this life. He loved the freedom, the danger, the simplicity of taking what you wanted and riding away. "You want out?" Red-Eye asked quietly. "I don't know what I want," Jesse admitted. "Maybe I just want a chance to be something other than Hawk Thornton the outlaw. Maybe I want to wake up one morning and not wonder if it's the day I die." "That woman really got to you." Jesse laughed bitterly. "You should have seen her, Red-Eye. Standing there in that coach like a queen on a throne, not an ounce of fear in her, calling me out by name. She looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her boot, and you know what? She was right. That's what I've become." "You're being too hard on yourself, Hawk. We ain't the worst men in the West, not by a long shot. We got our code. No killing innocents, no hurting women or children, no robbing folks who can't afford it. That's more than most outlaws can say." "Our code," Jesse repeated slowly. "Red-Eye, we're thieves. We rob stagecoaches. The fact that we don't murder people while doing it doesn't make us heroes, it just makes us thieves with marginally more decency than the average outlaw. And eventually our luck's going to run out. You know it as well as I do." Red-Eye couldn't argue with that. They'd had too many close calls lately, too many posses on their trail, too many times when they'd escaped by the skin of their teeth. The West was changing, becoming more civilized, more organized. The railroad was connecting once isolated towns, telegraph lines were making communication instant, and lawmen were starting to cooperate across territorial boundaries. So what do you want to do? Red-Eye asked. Jesse looked up at the canyon walls, at the ancient petroglyphs that had survived for centuries. I want one more score, he said. One big job that'll give us enough money to disappear, really disappear, not just hide out for a few months. Enough to start over somewhere new, maybe Mexico or South America, where our faces aren't known and our names don't mean anything. And then what? You going to buy a farm and raise chickens? Maybe. Or maybe I'll just sit on a beach somewhere and watch the ocean and try to forget everything I've done. Jesse stood up, stretching his tired muscles. But before we do anything, I need to know more about Eleanor Blackwood. Red-Eye groaned. Hawk, that's a terrible idea. She's William Blackwood's daughter, that makes her untouchable. You go anywhere near her and you'll bring down more heat than we can handle. I'm not planning to go near her, Jesse said. I just want to know who she is, what she's doing in Santa Fe, whether she's going to be a problem for us. Information, Red-Eye. Just information. But even as he said it, Jesse knew he was lying to himself. He didn't just want information about Eleanor Blackwood. He wanted to see her again, to talk to her, to understand why she'd affected him so profoundly. It was stupid, reckless, and probably suicidal, but he couldn't help himself. Love, he would learn, made fools of even the smartest men. 3 weeks passed. Eleanor threw herself into her work at the schoolhouse, teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography to 35 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. The students came from all backgrounds, Anglo, Mexican, Native American, Chinese, a perfect reflection of Santa Fe's diversity. Teaching in a frontier school was nothing like teaching in Boston. Eleanor didn't have proper textbooks for all her students, no blackboard, no supplies beyond what she could beg, borrow, or buy with her own money. The schoolhouse itself was a single room with rough-hewn benches, a pot-bellied stove for heat in winter, and windows that let in as much dust as light. But Eleanor loved it. She loved the eager faces of her students, the way they soaked up knowledge like the dry earth soaked up rain, the pride in their eyes when they mastered something difficult. She taught them McGuffey's Readers, the most popular textbooks in America, used by 122 million students between 1836 and 1960. She taught them the history of the United States, including the painful truths about slavery, war, and the treatment of Native Americans that many teachers preferred to gloss over. And she taught them to think for themselves, to question, to analyze, to never accept something just because an authority figure said it was true. This approach didn't always endear her to the more conservative parents in Santa Fe, but Eleanor didn't care. She believed that education was about creating independent minds, not obedient drones. Every day, Deputy Martinez sat outside the schoolhouse on a wooden chair, keeping watch as Sheriff Wade had promised. He was a young man, perhaps 22, with a serious face and a quick hand on his gun. Eleanor appreciated his presence but found it stifling, a constant reminder that she was in danger, that Jesse Thornton knew who she was. The truth was, she thought about Jesse Thornton far more than she wanted to admit. At night, lying in her room above Mrs. Chen's store, she'd find her mind wandering back to that moment in the stagecoach, analyzing their brief conversation, wondering what he was doing, where he was hiding, whether he ever thought about her. You're being absurd, she told herself repeatedly. He's an outlaw and you barely spoke 10 words to each other. But the heart, Eleanor was learning, didn't care about logic or reason. It wanted what it wanted, no matter how inappropriate or dangerous. On a Thursday evening in early September, Eleanor stayed late at the schoolhouse to prepare lessons for the following week. Deputy Martinez had been called away to help with a dispute at one of the saloons, leaving her alone for the first time since the robbery. The sun was setting, painting the adobe buildings of Santa Fe in shades of gold and amber, and Eleanor was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching the schoolhouse door. Evening, Miss Blackwood. Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. She spun around to find Jesse Thornton standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his gray eyes watchful but not threatening. He wore different clothes than during the robbery, a dark blue shirt, clean trousers, a brown leather vest, and he'd shaved, making him look younger and somehow more vulnerable. What are you doing here? Eleanor demanded, her hand instinctively reaching for the letter opener on her desk. A pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. I came to talk, Jesse said, not moving from the doorway. I won't come any closer if it makes you uncomfortable. I needed to see you again. You're insane. There are wanted posters with your face all over town. If anyone sees you. I know. I'm taking a hell of a risk being here. But I couldn't stop thinking about you, Miss Blackwood. About what you said, about how you looked at me. I needed to know if... He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. I needed to know if you were all right, if the robbery had frightened you. Eleanor should have screamed. She should have run for help, should have grabbed her derringer from her reticule, should have done anything except what she actually did, which was stand there staring at him, her heart racing, her mind spinning with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. You rode 60 miles into a town full of lawmen, risking capture and hanging, to ask if I was all right? She said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I know. They stared at each other across the schoolroom, and Eleanor felt that same electric connection she'd felt during the robbery, something powerful and dangerous and completely undeniable. This man was wanted by the law, had robbed the stagecoach she was riding, had a price on his head that would make any reasonable person run screaming for the sheriff. And yet, I'm fine, Eleanor said, her voice steadier now, shaken but unharmed. Though I've had a deputy watching me like a hawk for 3 weeks, which has been remarkably inconvenient. A small smile tugged at Jessie's lips. Like a hawk? That's unfortunate phrasing, given my nickname. I'm aware of the irony, Mr. Thornton. Call me Jessie. Mr. Thornton makes me sound like a banker or a lawyer. You're neither of those things, Eleanor said sharply. You're a criminal who steals from people trying to make honest livings. You're right, Jessie said, his smile fading. I'm all those things. But I wasn't always. Once I was just a farm boy from Missouri who believed in things like honor and duty and protecting what you loved. Then the war came and everything I believed in got burned to ash and blood. Eleanor found herself moving closer despite her better judgment, drawn by the pain in his voice. The Civil War ended 13 years ago, Mr. Thornton, Jessie. That's a long time to use it as an excuse for lawlessness. It's not an excuse, Jessie said quietly. It's an explanation. When the war ended, I was 17 years old. I'd killed my first man at 14, riding with guerrillas in Missouri. I'd seen my home burned, my father hanged by Union soldiers who thought he was a Confederate sympathizer, which he was, but that didn't make it any less horrible to watch. I'd learned to shoot, to steal, to survive in a world that had gone insane. And when the war ended, everyone just expected us to put down our guns and go back to being farmers and shopkeepers, like nothing had happened. He laughed bitterly. But I couldn't farm. The land was gone, taken for unpaid taxes. I couldn't get honest work because everyone knew I'd ridden with the guerrillas. I was 17 years old, Miss Blackwood, and the only skills I had were fighting and surviving. So that's what I did. Eleanor had heard similar stories before, how the war had broken young men, how the aftermath had been almost as terrible as the fighting itself, how thousands of displaced soldiers had turned to outlawry because they had no other options. The West was full of such men, ghosts of a conflict that had torn the nation apart. That explains how you became an outlaw, Eleanor said. It doesn't explain why you stayed one. You're clearly educated, intelligent, capable. You could find legitimate work if you wanted to. With a $3,000 bounty on my head? With wanted posters in every town? Miss Blackwood, Eleanor, I've been running for 8 years. There's no going back from that. The law doesn't forgive men like me. The law might surprise you, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the words. If you turned yourself in, cooperated with the authorities, perhaps. I'd hang, Jessie interrupted flatly. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. I've robbed too many stagecoaches, caused too much trouble. The railroad companies want to make an example of someone, and I'd be perfect. No, there's no redemption for me through the law. Then why are you here? Eleanor demanded, frustration creeping into her voice. If there's no hope, if you're doomed to be an outlaw forever, why risk everything to come here and talk to me? Jessie took a step closer, and Eleanor could see the struggle in his eyes, the war between what he wanted and what he knew was right. Because when I looked into your eyes during that robbery, I saw something I haven't seen in 8 years. I saw hope. I saw possibility. I saw a future that might be different from the past. And I couldn't let that go without at least trying to understand what it meant. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She should push him away, should call for help, should do anything except what she was actually doing, which was standing perfectly still as Jessie moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. This is madness, she whispered. I know. You're an outlaw. I'm a schoolteacher. My father would have you shot. I know. We have no future. No hope. No possibility of. Jessie kissed her. It was gentle and desperate and wrong and perfect all at once. Eleanor's mind screamed at her to pull away, but her body refused to obey. Instead, she found herself kissing him back, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, 8 years of proper Boston upbringing evaporating like morning dew in the desert sun. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, staring at each other with a mixture of shock and wonder. "I'm sorry," Jesse said, though he didn't look sorry. "I shouldn't have." "No, you shouldn't have," Eleanor agreed. But she didn't let go of his shirt. "This is insane, Jesse Thornton. Completely, utterly insane. Are you going to turn me in?" Eleanor hesitated, her mind racing. She should turn him in. It was her civic duty, her moral obligation. Jesse Thornton was a wanted criminal, and harboring such knowledge made her complicit in his crimes. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her hesitate, not just desire but a desperate longing for something better, something more. He was a man trapped by his past, haunted by his choices, searching for redemption in a world that offered none. "I should," she said finally. "But I won't. Not tonight. But Jesse, you can't come back here. It's too dangerous for both of us. If Deputy Martinez had been here." "I know. I just needed to see you, to talk to you, to know if what I felt during that robbery was real or just my imagination running wild." "And?" Eleanor asked, her heart pounding. "It's real," Jesse said softly. "Whatever this is, it's real." A noise outside, footsteps, voices, made them both freeze. Deputy Martinez was returning, and he wasn't alone. Eleanor could hear Sheriff Wade's gruff voice, probably checking on her since the deputy had left his post. "Go," Eleanor hissed urgently. "Out the back window quickly." Jesse hesitated, clearly torn between flight and fight. Then he grabbed Eleanor's hand, squeezed it once, and moved with surprising grace toward the back of the schoolroom. He slipped through the window like a shadow, and by the time Sheriff Wade and Deputy Martinez entered through the front door, there was no sign he'd ever been there. "Miss Blackwood," Sheriff Wade said, tipping his hat. "Working late again, I see. Martinez here tells me he had to step away for a spell. I wanted to make sure you were all right." "Perfectly fine, Sheriff," Eleanor said, amazed at how steady her voice sounded. "Just preparing tomorrow's lessons. You know how it is, education waits for no one." The sheriff looked around the schoolroom with suspicious eyes, and for a terrible moment, Eleanor was certain he could see Jesse's presence hanging in the air like smoke. But then he nodded, apparently satisfied. "Well, it's getting dark. Martinez will escort you home. Can't be too careful with Thornton still at large." "Of course, Sheriff. Thank you." As Deputy Martinez walked her back to Mrs. Chen's store, Eleanor's mind was spinning. She'd just kissed Jesse Thornton. She'd helped an outlaw escape. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and she had no idea what would happen next. But as she lay in bed that night, her fingers touching her lips where Jesse had kissed her, Eleanor realized something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She didn't regret it. Not one bit. The West was a land of harsh realities and impossible dreams, where the line between right and wrong often blurred like a mirage in the desert heat. And Eleanor Blackwood, proper Boston schoolteacher and daughter of a cattle baron, had just discovered that her heart didn't care about propriety or social standing or the law. It only cared about Jesse Thornton. Marshal Augustus Gus Tanner arrived in Santa Fe on a cool September morning, riding a black stallion and trailing a string of captured outlaws behind him like a funeral procession. He was a legend in law enforcement circles, a man who'd captured or killed more than 40 wanted criminals over his 15-year career as a U.S. Marshal. At 42 years old, Tanner was everything Jesse Thornton wasn't: legitimate, respected, unwavering in his belief that the law was the only thing separating civilization from chaos. He wore his badge like a shield and carried 2 custom Colt .45s with ivory handles that he'd won from a gambler in Dodge City. His face was all hard angles and ice-blue eyes that missed nothing, and his reputation for tenacity was matched only by his reputation for violence. "Marshal Tanner," Sheriff Wade said, shaking the man's hand with visible relief. "Thank God you're here. Jesse Thornton has been running circles around us for 2 years." "Not for much longer," Tanner said, his voice like gravel. "I've tracked him from Kansas to Colorado to here. I know his patterns, his hideouts, his methods. He's smart, I'll give him that, but nobody's that smart forever. Everyone makes mistakes." They stood in Sheriff Wade's office, a detailed map of New Mexico territory spread across the desk. Tanner had marked dozens of locations, robbery sites, suspected hideouts, towns where Thornton had been spotted. The pattern was clear to someone with Tanner's experience. Thornton was operating in a roughly circular pattern, always returning to the same general area after his robberies. He's got a base somewhere in this region, Tanner said, drawing a circle on the map that encompassed about 200 square miles of rough country north of Santa Fe. Probably a canyon or cave system, somewhere defensible with water and shelter. That's where he goes after every job. That's a lot of territory to search, Sheriff Wade said doubtfully. Most of it's unmapped wilderness. Then we use bait, Tanner replied coldly. The next gold shipment from Colorado comes through in 2 weeks. We spread the word that it'll be traveling the usual route, but we set up an ambush. When Thornton makes his move, we'll be ready. And if he doesn't take the bait? He will. Men like Thornton can't help themselves. They see opportunity and they have to take it. It's in their nature, like a wolf that can't pass up a wounded deer. Eleanor knew none of this. She was teaching her students about the Louisiana Purchase, the 1803 land deal in which the United States acquired approximately 827,000 square miles of territory from France for $15 million, effectively doubling the size of the young nation. The purchase had been controversial, with some arguing that President Thomas Jefferson had exceeded his constitutional authority, but it had proven to be one of the most important events in American history. Can anyone tell me why the Louisiana Purchase was so significant? Eleanor asked her class. A hand shot up, Maria Garcia, a bright 12-year-old whose family ran a bakery in town. Because it gave America access to the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans? Excellent, Maria. The Mississippi River was like a highway through the heart of the continent, and controlling it meant controlling trade throughout the interior. What else? Another hand, Thomas Chin, Mrs. Chen's grandson, a serious boy of 10 with his grandmother's sharp intelligence. It opened up the West for expansion. All this land we're standing on was part of the Louisiana Purchase. Exactly right, Thomas. The Louisiana Purchase included all or part of 15 current U.S. states, including New Mexico. It made westward expansion possible and inevitable. But, Eleanor paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. What was the cost of that expansion? Who paid the price? Her students were quiet, thinking. This was the kind of question that made some parents uncomfortable, but Eleanor believed in teaching the whole truth, not just the triumphant parts. Finally, a small voice from the back. Little Hawk, a Native American boy from the nearby pueblo, barely 7 years old but wise beyond his years. My people, he said quietly. The land was ours first. The white men took it. Yes, Eleanor said gently. The Native American tribes who'd lived on these lands for thousands of years were displaced, often violently. The westward expansion meant opportunity for some, but devastating loss for others. History is complicated, and we need to understand both the achievements and the costs. After school, Eleanor was surprised to find a note tucked into her satchel. The handwriting was rough but clear. Meet me at the old mission ruins north of town midnight tonight. I have something important to tell you. Please come. J. Eleanor's heart raced. Jessie wanted to meet again despite the danger, despite everything. She should ignore the note, should burn it and pretend she'd never received it. She should tell Sheriff Wade, should do her civic duty. Instead, she found herself planning how to sneak out without being noticed by Deputy Martinez. The San Miguel Mission ruins stood on a hill overlooking Santa Fe, the remnants of a church built in the early 1600s by Spanish friars. Lightning had struck the bell tower decades ago, and time and weather had done the rest. Now it was just crumbling adobe walls and memories, haunted by the ghosts of conquistadors and priests and Native Americans who'd labored to build it. Eleanor arrived at midnight, wrapped in a dark cloak, her heart pounding with fear and excitement. The moon was full, painting the ruins in silver light, and the wind whispered through the empty windows like the prayers of the dead. You came, Jessie said, stepping out of the shadows. He looked different tonight, tense, worried like a man carrying bad news. I wasn't sure you would. I shouldn't have, Eleanor said. This is dangerous and foolish and... A U.S. Marshal is in town, Jessie interrupted. Augustus Tanner. He's the best manhunter in the West and he's here for me. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. The next few weeks are going to be dangerous. If anyone discovers that we've met, that we have any connection at all, you'll be implicated. You could lose your job, your reputation, everything. Then why ask me to come here? Eleanor demanded. If it's so dangerous, why not just disappear? Because I couldn't leave without seeing you one more time, Jessie said, moving closer. Because in the 3 weeks since the robbery you're all I've thought about. Because when I look at you, I see a future I never thought I could have, a reason to be better than I am. Eleanor's breath caught. Jessie, you can't put that on me. I can't be your redemption. That's not fair. I know it's not fair. Nothing about this is fair. But it's the truth. He reached out, taking her hands in his. Eleanor, I'm planning one last job. One big score that'll give me enough money to disappear completely, to start over somewhere far away. And I want you to come with me. Eleanor stepped back, shocked. You want me to run away with you? To leave my students, my life, everything I've worked for? I know how it sounds. I know I'm asking the impossible. But Eleanor, I'm falling in love with you. Maybe I'm already in love with you. And I hope, that you feel the same way. Eleanor wanted to deny it, to laugh in his face, to tell him he was insane. But she couldn't because he was right. Somehow, impossibly, she'd fallen in love with Jesse Thornton. An outlaw, a wanted man, someone who represented everything her education and upbringing had taught her to despise. I do feel the same way, she whispered, the admission feeling both liberating and terrifying. But Jesse, love isn't enough. I have responsibilities, students who depend on me, a life here that means something. I can't just abandon all of that. I'm not asking you to decide now, Jesse said. I'm asking you to think about it. The job I'm planning is in 2 weeks. After that, I'll be gone, either dead or vanished forever. I want you to come with me, but I'll understand if you can't. I just needed you to know that the option exists, that somewhere in this world, there's a man who loves you enough to give you everything he has. Which is nothing, Eleanor said, but without malice. You have nothing to give me, Jesse, except danger and uncertainty and a life on the run. I have my heart, Jesse replied simply. It's battered and scarred and not worth much, but it's yours if you want it. Eleanor looked into his gray eyes and saw the truth there. He meant every word. This wasn't a game or a trick. Jesse Thornton, outlaw and thief, was offering her his heart with the same sincerity a proper gentleman might offer marriage and respectability. I need time to think, she said finally. This is too big, too important to decide in a moment. Take all the time you need, Jesse said. But Eleanor, be careful. Marshall Tanner is setting a trap. I don't know the details, but I know his reputation. He's patient and smart and ruthless. If he discovers our connection. He won't, Eleanor promised. I'll be careful. Jesse pulled her close, and they stood there in the ruins of the old mission, holding each other under the moon while the ghosts of Spanish priests and native converts whispered around them. For a moment, Eleanor let herself imagine it, running away with Jesse, starting a new life in some distant place, leaving behind propriety and duty and all the rules that had governed her life. It was a beautiful dream. But dreams, Eleanor knew, had a way of turning into nightmares in the harsh light of reality. Marshall Tanner's plan was simple but effective. He would stage a fake gold shipment, complete with an authentic-looking strongbox filled with rocks and iron weights, and wait for Jesse Thornton to take the bait. The real gold would travel by a different route entirely, but Thornton wouldn't know that until it was too late. The plan relied on information deliberately leaked to known associates of outlaws, bartenders, saloon girls, crooked shopkeepers who made money on both sides of the law. Within days, half the territory knew that a major gold shipment would be traveling the Santa Fe route on the 15th of September. Jesse heard about it from a contact in Albuquerque, a telegraph operator named Phillips who owed him a favor. Big shipment coming through, Phillips said over a whiskey in a dark saloon. 20,000 in gold, traveling with just 2 guards. Seems almost too good to be true. Because it probably is, Red Eye said when Jesse told him about it. Hawk, this smells like a trap. The timing's too convenient, right after that Marshall arrived in Santa Fe. They're using us as bait. Maybe, Jesse agreed. But what if it's real? What if this is our chance for that one last score we talked about? $20,000, Red Eye. That's enough to disappear forever. They were in their canyon hideout, planning by firelight while coyotes howled in the distance. Jesse had barely slept in days, torn between his desire to see Eleanor again and his instinct for self-preservation. He'd sent her 3 more notes, but she hadn't responded to any of them, and he didn't know if that meant she was being careful or if she'd decided he was too dangerous to associate with. I don't like it, Red Eye insisted. My gut says this is a trap and my gut's kept us alive this long. Your gut also told you that Cantina in El Paso was safe, and we nearly got shot, Jesse countered. Look, we'll scout it out carefully. If it feels wrong, we walk away. But if it's legitimate, we take it. This could be our ticket out, Red Eye. Our chance to finally stop running. Red Eye studied his partner's face in the firelight and saw something that worried him: desperation. Jesse Thornton had always been careful, calculating, never taking unnecessary risks. But something had changed in him since that robbery 3 weeks ago, since he'd met Eleanor Blackwood. This is about that woman, isn't it? Red Eye said. You're taking risks for her. I'm taking risks for us, Jesse corrected. For a future that doesn't involve dying in a shootout or hanging from a rope. But yes, Eleanor's part of it. She makes me want to be better, Red-Eye. She makes me remember the man I was before the war, before all of this. And what if she won't come with you? What if you get this gold and she stays in Santa Fe teaching school? Jesse was quiet for a long moment. Then at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll know I offered her something real. They spent the next week preparing, checking and rechecking their guns, studying the route, identifying escape paths and backup plans. Jesse sent one final note to Eleanor, telling her about the job, asking her one last time if she'd come with him afterward. He left it with Mrs. Chen, trusting the old woman's discretion, and waited for a response that never came. Meanwhile, Eleanor was torn apart by indecision. She knew Jesse was planning something dangerous. His last note had made that clear, and she knew she should tell Sheriff Wade, should warn him that Jesse might be walking into a trap. But warning Jesse would mean admitting their connection, would expose her as an accomplice, would destroy everything she'd built in Santa Fe. And staying silent might mean Jesse's death, might mean never seeing him again, might mean living the rest of her life wondering what if. She confided in the only person she could trust, Mrs. Chen, who'd lived long enough and seen enough to understand the complications of the heart. "You love this outlaw man," Mrs. Chen said one evening, serving Eleanor tea in her small apartment above the store. "Your face tell me everything when you read his letters." "I barely know him," Eleanor protested weakly. "We've met twice, spoken maybe 100 words total." "Love not about words," Mrs. Chen said wisely. "Love about seeing someone's soul, understanding their heart. I see my husband 3 times before we marry in China. 3 times. But I know his soul, know he good man. We have 20 years together before he die. 20 good years. But Jesse's an outlaw, Mrs. Chen. He's wanted by the law. There's no future there. Future is what we make, Miss Eleanor. In China they tell me I have no future. Woman alone, husband dead, strange country. But I make future anyway. You strong woman like me. You decide what future you want, then you make it happen." Eleanor sipped her tea thinking. Mrs. Chen made it sound so simple, but the reality was far more complicated. If she ran away with Jesse, she'd be a fugitive herself. She'd never see her father again, never teach again, never have the life she'd imagined for herself. But if she stayed, if she let Jesse disappear forever, she'd spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. On the morning of September 15th, Eleanor made her decision. She asked Deputy Martinez if she could visit her father's ranch, a reasonable request as she hadn't seen him in weeks. The deputy agreed to escort her to the edge of town, where ranch hands would meet her. But Eleanor didn't go to the ranch. Instead, she rode north toward the ambush site, determined to warn Jesse before it was too late. The stagecoach rattled along the trail at exactly 3 o'clock, right on schedule. Jesse and Red-Eye watched from their usual position behind the rocks, but something felt wrong. The coach was moving too fast, the driver wasn't Captain Reyes, and there were no passengers visible through the windows. "It's a trap," Jesse said quietly. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could move, Marshal Tanner's voice rang out from above them. "Jesse Thornton. You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender, and you'll get a fair trial." Jesse looked up to see rifle barrels pointing at them from the canyon walls, at least a dozen lawmen positioned perfectly to catch them in a crossfire. Tanner had outthought him, had anticipated every move, had turned this ambush site into a killing ground. "What do we do?" Red-Eye whispered, his hand on his gun. "We fight," Jesse said grimly. "We try to break through to the horses. On my signal." "Wait." A woman's voice cut through the tension, and Jesse's heart stopped as he saw Eleanor riding toward them on a brown mare, waving her arms frantically. "Stop. Don't shoot." "Eleanor, no." Jesse shouted, but it was too late. She was between them and the lawmen now, making herself a shield, forcing everyone to hold their fire. "Miss Blackwood, get out of the way." Marshal Tanner bellowed from above. "You're interfering with federal law enforcement. These men deserve a chance to surrender peacefully." Eleanor shouted back. "You have them trapped. There's no need for violence." Jesse stared at her in amazement and horror. She'd risked everything to warn him, to save him, and now she was in the middle of what was about to become a bloodbath. "Eleanor, please," Jesse called to her. "Right away. This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is," she said, turning to look at him with those fierce green eyes. "I love you, Jesse Thornton. I'm not going to stand by and watch you die." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Marshal Tanner heard them. Sheriff Wade, positioned among the lawmen, heard them. Everyone heard Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of William Blackwood, declare her love for one of the most wanted outlaws in the West. "Miss Blackwood," Tanner said, his voice dangerous now. "You're confessing to aiding and abetting a known criminal. Step away, or I'll have you arrested as an accomplice." "Then arrest me," Eleanor said defiantly. "But I won't move until you give Jesse a chance to surrender peacefully. He hasn't hurt anyone, Marshal. He's just a thief, not a murderer. He deserves better than being gunned down like a rabid dog." Jesse felt something break inside him. A wall he'd built around his heart, a barrier that had protected him from feeling too much, caring too deeply. Eleanor was willing to sacrifice everything for him, was putting herself between him and justice itself. He couldn't let her do that. "All right," Jesse called out, raising his hands. "I surrender. But Red Eye goes free. He was just following my orders, and Miss Blackwood has nothing to do with any of this. She's lying to protect me out of some misguided sense of compassion. Don't punish her for my crimes." "Hawk, no," Red Eye said urgently. "We can fight our way out. We've been in worse." "No, we haven't," Jesse interrupted. "It's over, my friend. But you can still get away. When the shooting starts, and it will, you run for the horses and you ride like hell. Promise me. I'm not leaving you. Promise me." Jesse's voice was fierce. "One of us needs to survive this, Red Eye. One of us needs to make it out and live the life we talked about. Do it for both of us." Red Eye's scarred face twisted with anguish, but he nodded. They'd been partners for 8 years, brothers in everything but blood, and this might be the last time they ever saw each other. "Throw down your weapons," Marshal Tanner commanded. "Both of you slowly." Jesse unholstered his Colt Peacemaker, the gun that had saved his life dozens of times, and tossed it to the ground. Red Eye did the same, though Jesse could see his partner tensing, preparing to move. What happened next would become legend in the West, a story told and retold in saloons and around campfires for generations. Just as Marshal Tanner and his men began to descend from their positions, a shot rang out, not from Jesse or Red Eye or the lawman, but from a completely unexpected direction. One of the marshal's deputies cried out and fell, clutching his shoulder. Suddenly the canyon erupted in chaos. More shots came from the rocks to the east, a rival gang of outlaws, the Dalton brothers, who'd been tracking the same gold shipment and weren't about to let the law ruin their score. "It's the Daltons," someone shouted. "Take cover." In the confusion, Jesse grabbed Eleanor and pulled her down behind the rocks while Red Eye dove for their horses. Bullets whined through the air, ricocheting off stone, kicking up geysers of dirt. The lawmen were returning fire at the Daltons were shooting at everyone, and suddenly the carefully planned ambush had turned into a three-way battle. "Can you ride?" Jesse shouted to Eleanor over the gunfire. "Of course I can ride. But Jesse, no time. We have to move now." He half-dragged, half-carried her to where Red Eye had the horses ready. They mounted up just as Marshal Tanner realized what was happening and turned his fire on them. Bullets tore through the air around them as Jesse spurred Tempest forward, with Eleanor clinging to him and Red Eye riding alongside. They burst out of the canyon at full gallop, riding like their lives depended on it, which they absolutely did. Behind them, the battle raged on, with the Daltons and the lawmen trading shots and curses. They rode for an hour straight, pushing the horses to their limits, before Jesse finally slowed and led them into a narrow side canyon where they could rest and regroup. "We're alive," Red Eye said, almost disbelieving. "We actually made it out." "Thanks to the Daltons," Jesse said. "Never thought I'd be grateful to those crazy bastards." Eleanor slid down from Tempest, her legs shaking. She'd ridden hard before on her father's ranch, but never like this, never running from the law, never with bullets flying around her head, never with her entire life crumbling behind her. "What have I done?" she whispered, the reality of her situation finally hitting her. "I just confessed to loving an outlaw in front of Marshal Tanner and Sheriff Wade. I'll be arrested. I'll lose everything." Jesse dismounted and went to her, taking her hands in his. "You saved my life," he said gently. "You risked everything to warn me, to protect me." "Eleanor, why?" "Because I meant what I said," Eleanor replied, tears streaming down her face. "I love you, Jesse Thornton. I don't know how or why, but I do. And I couldn't let them kill you without at least trying to stop it." Jesse pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried. Red Eye discreetly turned away, checking the horses, giving them privacy in this moment of vulnerability. "What do we do now?" Eleanor asked when her tears finally stopped. "I can't go back to Santa Fe. I can't face my father. I've destroyed my entire life for you." "Then we do what I suggested before," Jesse said. We disappear. All three of us. We take what little money we have, we ride south to Mexico, and we start over. It won't be the life you imagined, Eleanor. It'll be hard and uncertain and dangerous. But we'll be together. And maybe someday we'll find a way to make peace with the past. Eleanor looked up at him, her green eyes still wet with tears but also filled with determination. You promise me something, Jesse Thornton? Anything. Promise me that we'll build something good. That this sacrifice, this choice I'm making, will lead to something more than just running and hiding. Promise me that we'll find a way to make a real life, even if it's not the life I planned. I promise, Jesse said solemnly. I swear on my life, Eleanor, I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of what you've given up for me. They kissed then, a kiss that sealed their fate, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, outlaws and fugitives bound together by a love that neither law nor society could break. Hate to interrupt, Red-Eye said apologetically, but we need to keep moving. Tanner's going to come after us soon as that firefight ends, and he's not going to give up easy. We need to put as many miles between us and Santa Fe as possible. Jesse nodded. They mounted up again, with Eleanor riding behind Jesse on Tempest, her arms wrapped around his waist. As they rode out of the canyon and turned south toward Mexico and an uncertain future, Eleanor took one last look back toward Santa Fe, toward the schoolhouse where her students waited, toward the life she'd built and the dreams she'd dreamed. But she didn't regret her choice. Not then and not in all the years that followed. Because some loves are worth any sacrifice. Some loves are strong enough to survive loss and hardship and all the cruelties the world can devise. Some loves simply refuse to die, no matter what forces try to kill them. Eleanor and Jesse's love was one of those. And their story, the story of a schoolteacher and an outlaw who found each other in the midst of the violent, chaotic, beautiful American West, was just beginning. They rode for 3 days straight, stopping only to rest the horses and grab a few hours of sleep. Jesse knew every trail, every water source, every place where they could hide if a posse came too close. He'd spent 8 years learning the landscape of the Southwest, and now that knowledge was all that stood between them and capture. The terrain gradually changed as they traveled south. The high desert mountains of New Mexico gave way to lower, hotter country, vast expanses of scrubland dotted with mesquite and creosote bush, broken by sudden arroyos carved by flash floods. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, and at night the temperature dropped so suddenly that they huddled around small fires trying to stay warm. Eleanor had never experienced anything like this journey. Her rides on her father's ranch had been leisurely affairs with water canteens and packed lunches and the certainty that a comfortable bed waited at the end of the day. This was different. This was survival stripped to its bare essentials, where every decision mattered and mistakes could be fatal. Her hands blistered from holding the reins. Her face burned from sun exposure despite the wide-brimmed hat Red-Eye had found for her at an abandoned homestead. Her muscles ached from days in the saddle, and she'd discovered muscles she never knew existed. But she didn't complain. She'd made her choice and she'd live with it. On the 4th night, they camped in a box canyon with good sight lines and a small stream that provided fresh water. Jesse shot a jackrabbit for dinner, an impressive display of marksmanship that reminded Eleanor that this gentle man who held her at night was also a dangerous gunfighter who'd survived 8 years as an outlaw. As Red-Eye skinned and cooked the rabbit over their fire, Eleanor sat with Jesse on a flat rock, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The stars in the west seemed brighter than anywhere else, undimmed by city lights or factory smoke, a vast canopy of silver points that made a person feel both insignificant and part of something infinite. "Tell me about your father," Jesse said quietly. "About your life before you came west." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "My father is William Blackwood, one of the richest cattle barons in New Mexico. He came west in 1865, right after the war ended, with nothing but determination and borrowed money. He built an empire through sheer will and ruthless business sense." "And your mother?" "She died when I was 12. Pneumonia. After that, it was just father and me. He didn't remarry, said no woman could replace her. He threw himself into building his ranch and I threw myself into books and learning. He wanted to send me to finishing school back east, to turn me into a proper lady, but I wanted more than that. I wanted to matter, to make a difference." "So you became a teacher," Jesse said. "So I became a teacher. Against father's wishes, I might add. He thought teaching was beneath a woman of my station, that I should be focused on finding a suitable husband. Someone who could help expand his business empire. We argued terribly about it." Eleanor smiled sadly at the memory. "The last thing I said to him before leaving for Santa Fe was that I'd rather die unmarried and free than live as someone's trophy wife. I suppose I've fulfilled that promise, though not in the way either of us imagined. Do you regret it? Jesse asked. Choosing this life over the one your father wanted for you? Eleanor turned to look at him, this outlaw who'd stolen her heart as surely as he'd stolen that Spanish gold. I regret hurting him. I regret leaving my students without explanation. I regret the scandal this will cause and the way it will reflect on everyone I care about. But do I regret choosing you? No. Not even a little. Jesse kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender it made Eleanor's heart ache. I'll make this up to you somehow, he promised. I'll build you a life worth living even if it takes the rest of my days. I'll hold you to that, Jesse Thornton. Red Eye approached with the cooked rabbit, and they ate in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Red Eye had been remarkably accepting of Eleanor's presence, treating her with a rough courtesy that suggested he'd known from the start that she would change everything. After dinner, as Eleanor settled into her bedroll near the fire, Red Eye pulled Jesse aside for a private conversation. We're being followed, Red Eye said quietly. I spotted dust on our trail this afternoon, maybe 5 miles back. One rider moving careful-like. Jesse's jaw tightened. Tanner? Could be. Or could be a bounty hunter smelling easy money. Either way, we need to deal with it before we cross the border. Can't have someone tracking us into Mexico. Tomorrow morning we'll split up, Jesse said, his mind already working through the plan. You take Eleanor and keep heading south. I'll double back and see who's following us. If it's trouble, I'll lead them away. If it's nothing, I'll catch up with you by nightfall. Hawk, if it's Tanner? Then I'll handle it, Jesse interrupted. I won't let him catch us, not after we've come this far. We're so close, Red Eye. Mexico's maybe 2 days away and then we're free. We just need to make it a little further. Red Eye studied his partner's face in the firelight, seeing the determination there but also the fear, not for himself but for Eleanor. Jesse Thornton had always been fearless when only his own life was at stake, but now he had something to lose, and that changed everything. Be careful, Red Eye said finally. That woman over there needs you. Don't do anything heroic and stupid. When have I ever done anything heroic and stupid? Jesse asked with a slight smile. You want me to list the times? Because we'll be here all night. They shared a brief laugh, but both men knew the gravity of the situation. Someone was following them, and whoever it was, they meant business. The next morning, Jesse woke before dawn. He kissed Eleanor gently, she murmured something in her sleep but didn't wake, and then saddled Tempest as quietly as possible. Red Eye was already awake, his keen eyes watching the trail behind them. Take care of her, Jesse said, clasping his partner's hand. If something happens to me... Nothing's going to happen to you, Red Eye said firmly. You're too stubborn to die. Now go. We'll see you tonight. Jesse rode back the way they'd come, using every trick he'd learned over 8 years of evading lawmen, riding on rock when possible to avoid leaving tracks, doubling back on his own trail, using the landscape to hide his movements. The sun rose slowly, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, and Jesse felt a strange sense of peace despite the danger. He found the tracker around midday, camped in a small arroyo about 8 miles behind where they'd spent the night. But it wasn't Marshal Tanner or a bounty hunter. It was Eleanor's father, William Blackwood. He sat by a small fire, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his expensive clothes dusty from travel but still somehow maintaining an air of authority. At 62 years old, William Blackwood was still an imposing figure, 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of a man who'd built his empire through physical labor as much as business acumen. His weathered face was deeply tanned and his blue eyes, so much like Eleanor's though different in color, were sharp and intelligent. Mr. Thornton, he said calmly when Jesse appeared. I've been expecting you. Jesse kept his hand near his gun, wary of a trap. How'd you find us? I'm William Blackwood. I own 40,000 acres of ranch land and employ 200 men. When my daughter runs away with an outlaw, I have resources most people don't. I've had trackers following you since you left Santa Fe. He paused, pouring coffee from a pot by his fire. Sit down, son. If I wanted you dead, you'd already have a bullet in you. I just want to talk. Cautiously, Jesse dismounted and approached the fire, though he remained standing. If you're here to convince me to let Eleanor go, you're wasting your time. She made her choice. I'm aware of what my daughter chose, William said, his voice heavy with a mixture of anger and sadness. Sheriff Wade told me everything, how she confessed to loving you in front of Marshal Tanner and half the lawmen in the territory, how she put herself between you and the law, how she threw away her entire future for a man she barely knows. I love her, Jesse said simply. and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of her. William looked up at him, studying Jesse's face with the same keen intelligence that Eleanor had inherited. You know what's interesting, Mr. Thornton? I investigated you. Had my people dig into your background, find out who you really are. Did you know what I discovered? That I'm a thief and an outlaw with a $3,000 bounty on my head? No. I discovered that you're James Thornton Jr., son of James and Margaret Thornton of Independence, Missouri. Your father owned a successful freight business before the war. You attended school through 8th grade, remarkable for a frontier boy, and were considered bright and promising. Then the war came and your father was executed by Union soldiers for harboring Confederate guerrillas. Your mother died 6 months later from grief and illness. You were 14 years old, and you joined up with Quantrill's raiders to avenge your father. Jesse felt his chest tighten. No one had spoken those names, his parents' names, in years. So you know I'm from good people who got destroyed by the war. That doesn't change what I became. No, but it explains it, William said. You were a child who lost everything and learned to survive the only way you could. That's not an excuse for your crimes, Mr. Thornton, but it does show that you're more than just a common criminal. You have intelligence, honor in your own way, and apparently, the capacity to inspire great love in my very difficult, very stubborn daughter. Where is this going, Mr. Blackwood? William stood up, facing Jesse directly. I'm offering you a deal. Come work for me. Legitimate work, security, ranch management, whatever suits your skills. I'll pay you a fair wage, provide housing for you and Eleanor, and most importantly, I'll use my connections to make your legal troubles disappear. It won't be easy or quick, but I have friends, judges, politicians, railroad executives. With enough time and money, we can get your record cleared. Jesse stared at him, shocked. You're offering to help me? The man who stole your daughter? I'm offering to help the man my daughter loves, William corrected. Eleanor has never been impulsive or foolish. If she sees something in you worth sacrificing everything for, then I have to believe it's there, even if I can't see it yet. Besides, he smiled grimly, she's more like me than either of us care to admit. Once she makes up her mind, there's no changing it. I can either accept her choice and try to make the best of it, or I can lose my only child forever. Which would you choose? Jesse felt a pressure building in his chest, hope, painful and dangerous, threatening to overwhelm him. What's the catch? The catch is that you have to actually become an honest man, Mr. Thornton. No more robberies, no more running. You settle down, work hard, and you marry my daughter properly. And, his voice grew harder. If you ever hurt her, if you ever betray her trust or treat her with anything less than the respect she deserves, I will personally hunt you down and kill you. I'm old, but I'm not soft, and I protect what's mine. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Jesse said. But Mr. Blackwood, there's Marshal Tanner. He won't give up, won't let this go. My record can't just disappear while he's still hunting me. Augustus Tanner is a problem, I'll grant you that. But he's not insurmountable. I have business relationships with several railroad companies he's worked for. A word in the right ears, pressure in the right places, and we can convince him to look elsewhere for glory. It'll take time though. You'll need to lay low, work on my ranch, keep your head down for at least a year, maybe 2. Jesse thought about Eleanor, about the life they could have if this impossible offer was real. A chance at legitimacy, at redemption, at building something real instead of just running and hiding. It was everything he'd dreamed of but never believed possible. Why, he asked. Why help me when you could just as easily have me arrested or shot? William was quiet for a moment, staring into his fire. Because 25 years ago I was you. Not an outlaw but a nobody with nothing, just ambition and determination and the recklessness of youth. And a woman from a wealthy Boston family fell in love with me anyway, against her family's wishes, against all common sense. She gave up everything to come west with me, and she gave me the best years of my life before she died. His voice grew thick with emotion. Eleanor's mother, Catherine, taught me that love doesn't always make sense, doesn't always follow the rules. And the greatest gift we can give the people we love is the chance to choose their own path, even if it terrifies us. So I'm giving Eleanor that gift, and I'm giving you the chance to prove that her faith in you isn't misplaced. Jesse felt something shift inside him, the beginning of a transformation he'd never thought possible. I accept your offer, Mr. Blackwood. And I promise you, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the man Eleanor believes I can be. William nodded, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bottle of good whiskey, nothing like the rotgut Jesse had been drinking for years, but smooth Kentucky bourbon that cost more than most men made in a month. Let's drink to new beginnings, William said, pouring 2 glasses. and to the remarkable women who make fools of us all. They drank together as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, an outlaw and a cattle baron making peace over whiskey and shared understanding. It was an unlikely alliance, but then again the West was built on unlikely alliances, between cowboys and farmers, outlaws and lawmen, settlers and natives who learned to live side by side. When Jesse caught up with Eleanor and Red Eye that evening, he had news that changed everything. They made camp in a protected spot near the Mexican border, and Jesse told them about his conversation with William Blackwood, about the impossible offer that might give them a chance at a real life. Eleanor listened with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by her father's generosity and the possibility that she might not have to choose between Jesse and her family after all. "He did that," she whispered. "He's willing to help us?" "He's willing to try," Jesse said carefully. "It won't be easy and there are no guarantees. But Eleanor, if we can make this work, we won't have to run forever. We can build something real." Red Eye was less enthusiastic. "And what about me? I'm still wanted, still an outlaw. This salvation of yours doesn't extend to me." "Mr. Blackwood says if you're willing to work for him legitimately, he'll help you too," Jesse said. "Not as quickly or easily, but given time he can make your troubles disappear as well. Red Eye, this is our chance, all of us. A chance to stop running." Red Eye stood up and walked away from the fire, his massive frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. He was quiet for a long time, wrestling with the decision. He'd been an outlaw for even longer than Jesse, had known no other life since he was 16 years old. The idea of settling down, of working a legitimate job, of following someone else's rules, it felt like a cage. But he was also tired. Tired of running, tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of wondering which day would be his last. And Jesse was his brother in everything but blood. If Jesse had found a way out, found a woman worth changing for, then maybe it was time for Red Eye to change too. "All right," he said finally, turning back to face them. "I'm in. God help us all, I'm in." Eleanor laughed and cried at the same time, throwing her arms around Jesse and then, impulsively, around Red Eye, who stiffened in surprise before awkwardly patting her back. "We're going to make this work," Eleanor said fiercely. "All of us together. We're going to build something good out of all this chaos." That night, as they sat around the fire under a canopy of stars, the three of them made plans. They'd go to William Blackwood's ranch, the Double B it was called, one of the largest spreads in New Mexico. Jesse and Red Eye would work as ranch hands at first, learning the legitimate side of the cattle business. Eleanor would teach at the local school, though likely under a different name until the scandal died down. It wouldn't be glamorous. It wouldn't be easy. But it would be theirs, a life built on hard work and determination and a love that had survived impossible odds. The Double B Ranch sprawled across 40,000 acres of some of the best cattle country in New Mexico, rolling grasslands interspersed with pinyon pines and juniper, cut through by streams that never fully dried even in the hottest summers. William Blackwood had chosen his land well when he'd arrived in 1865, staking his claim before the territory became too settled, before land prices climbed too high. The main ranch house was a sprawling adobe structure with a red tile roof, Spanish colonial style adapted for the American frontier. It had thick walls that kept it cool in summer and warm in winter, large rooms that could accommodate William's business associates when they came calling, and a magnificent view of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the distance. Behind the main house were the bunkhouses where the ranch hands lived, simple but solid structures that could house 20 men each. There was a blacksmith shop, a stable that could hold 50 horses, corrals for breaking and training, a cookhouse that served 3 meals a day to the entire ranch crew, and dozens of outbuildings for storing equipment, feed, and supplies. The Double B ran 20,000 head of cattle, mostly Texas Longhorns, the tough, rangy breed that had made the great cattle drives possible. These weren't the docile dairy cows of the East, but half-wild animals with horns that could span 6 feet from tip to tip, capable of surviving in harsh conditions that would kill more delicate breeds. William Blackwood introduced Jesse and Red Eye to his operation with a simple speech delivered to the assembled ranch hands on their first morning. "These 2 men are starting work today," he said, standing on the porch of the main house while his crew gathered below. "I know there are wanted posters with their faces on them. I know they've lived outside the law. But they're working for me now, and that means they're under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can collect their pay and move on. Anyone who stays treats them like any other member of this crew. Are we clear?" There was muttering, skeptical looks, but no one left. Jobs were hard to come by in New Mexico territory, and William Blackwood paid better than most ranchers. If the boss wanted to hire reformed outlaws, that was his business. Jesse and Red Eye were assigned to the hardest, dirtiest jobs on the ranch, mucking out stables, mending fences in the brutal sun, breaking horses that hadn't been ridden, rounding up strays in rough country. It was back-breaking work that left them exhausted and sore at the end of each day, but it was honest work and that made all the difference. Eleanor, meanwhile, had taken a position at the small schoolhouse that served the children of ranch hands and nearby settlers. She taught under her own name. There was no point in hiding as everyone knew who she was, but she held her head high, refusing to be ashamed of her choices. The scandal had indeed spread throughout the territory. Newspapers as far away as Denver and San Francisco had printed stories about the cattle baron's daughter and the outlaw, embellishing the tale with romantic details that were partly true and partly invention. Some people condemned Eleanor as a fallen woman who'd disgraced her family. Others celebrated her as a romantic heroine who'd chosen love over duty. Eleanor didn't care what they said. She had her students, her teaching, and every evening she had Jesse, exhausted and dirt-covered but genuinely happy for the first time in his adult life. They lived in a small cabin on the edge of the ranch property, a simple two-room structure that Eleanor had made into a home with curtains she'd sewn herself, furniture Jesse had built in the ranch workshop, and books she'd brought from Santa Fe. They weren't married yet. William had insisted they wait until some of the scandal died down, until Jesse's legal situation was more settled, but everyone on the ranch treated them as if they were. In the West, actions mattered more than ceremonies, and Jesse and Eleanor's commitment to each other was obvious to anyone with eyes. Months passed. Summer faded into fall, fall into winter. Jesse learned the cattle business from the ground up, how to read the land, how to predict weather patterns, how to spot sick animals before the sickness spread, how to manage men who were testing whether he was really the notorious Hawk Thornton or just another ranch hand. Red Eye, surprisingly, took to legitimate work like he'd been born for it. His size and strength made him invaluable for heavy labor, and his intimidating appearance made him perfect for dealing with cattle rustlers and claim jumpers who occasionally tested William Blackwood's boundaries. He even developed an unexpected talent for breaking horses, his patience and gentleness with the animals contrasting sharply with his fearsome exterior. But Marshal Augustus Tanner hadn't given up. Tanner arrived at the Doubleby Ranch on a cold January morning, riding his black stallion and trailing 3 deputies. He'd spent 4 months tracking Jesse Thornton, following every lead, questioning every contact, refusing to accept that the outlaw had simply vanished. When he'd learned that Jesse was working for William Blackwood, he'd been furious but not surprised. Rich men protecting outlaws was nothing new in the West. They did it all the time when those outlaws had skills they needed or connections they valued. But Tanner was determined to see justice done, regardless of who was protecting his quarry. William met him at the main house, his face impassive, his stance relaxed but ready. At 62 he was still capable of backing up any words he spoke and Tanner knew it. "Marshal," William said coolly, "to what do I owe this visit?" "You know exactly why I'm here, Mr. Blackwood. I'm here for Jesse Thornton and Thomas McGraw. You're harboring wanted fugitives, which makes you guilty of obstruction of justice." "I'm employing 2 ranch hands," William corrected. "Men who've committed no crime since coming to work for me, men who've been model employees. You have a problem with that?" "I have a problem with outlaws going unpunished," Tanner said, his ice-blue eyes hard. "I don't care how rich you are or how many politicians you know. The law is the law." "The law is interpretation," William replied. "And I have lawyers who earn in a month what you make in a year. You try to arrest my men, Marshal, and I'll bury you in legal proceedings that'll last until you're too old to remember why you started them." Tanner's hand moved toward his gun, and instantly every ranch hand in sight did the same. 20 armed men suddenly appeared from various buildings, all of them loyal to William Blackwood, all of them ready to defend the Doubleby against outside threats. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and the ranch yard would erupt in violence that would leave bodies scattered across the dirt. "Stand down," came a voice from behind William, and Jesse Thornton stepped out of the ranch house, his hands held away from his sides, making it clear he was unarmed. "Marshal Tanner, you want me? Fine. I'll come peacefully. Just don't bring violence to these people who've given me a chance at redemption." "Jesse, no." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "You promised me. You promised we'd build a life together." "And we will," Jesse said gently. "But not if it means Mr. Blackwood's ranch becoming a war zone, not if it means his men dying to protect me. I won't have that on my conscience." Tanner studied Jesse carefully, trying to understand this play. Outlaws didn't surrender, they fought or ran. This smelled like a trap, like some scheme to catch him off guard. "You'll come peacefully?" Tanner asked skeptically. You'll stand trial for your crimes? Yes. With one condition. You're not in a position to make conditions, Thornton. Hear him out, William said quietly, and something in his voice made Tanner pause. Jesse took a deep breath. I'll plead guilty to the robberies I committed. I won't fight the charges, won't claim innocence. But in exchange, you drop any investigation into Eleanor Blackwood or anyone else on this ranch. They're innocent. They didn't help me commit crimes, didn't aid me in any way that matters legally. Eleanor's only crime was falling in love with the wrong man, and she's paid for that enough already. And Thomas McGraw? Tanner pressed. What about him? Red Eye's crimes were all done at my orders, Jesse said. He was following my lead, and when we split up after that last job, he came straight here and went legitimate. He's been working honest for 4 months now, Marshal. Isn't that what we're supposed to want? Don't we want outlaws to reform? Tanner was quiet for a long moment, thinking. He'd spent 15 years as a U.S. Marshal, had captured or killed 40 wanted men, had made his reputation on uncompromising dedication to the law. But he was also smart enough to recognize when he was beaten. William Blackwood had money, influence, and 200 armed ranch hands. If Tanner tried to force the issue, he'd likely end up dead or worse, humiliated. And for what? To arrest an outlaw who was clearly trying to go straight, who'd surrendered peacefully and was willing to face justice. All right, Tanner said finally. I'll accept your surrender, Thornton. You'll be tried in Santa Fe for the stagecoach robberies. If convicted, you'll serve your sentence. McGraw can stay here, provisionally, but if he sets one foot wrong, I'll be back for him. And Miss Blackwood. He looked at Eleanor with something that might have been sympathy. Your reputation is your own problem. I'm not in the business of punishing people for poor choices in matters of the heart. Eleanor felt tears of relief streaming down her face as Jesse was placed in shackles. He looked back at her, his gray eyes full of love and pain and hope. Wait for me, he said quietly. However long it takes, wait for me. I'll come back to you, Eleanor. I swear it. I'll wait forever if I have to, Eleanor promised. Just don't you dare die on me, Jesse Thornton. As Marshal Tanner led Jesse away, William Blackwood put his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, and she leaned into him, crying for the first time since her mother had died all those years ago. He'll be all right, William said softly. I'll hire the best lawyers in the territory. We'll get him a fair trial and, with luck, a sentence he can survive. This isn't over, Eleanor. Not by a long shot. Red Eye stood nearby, his scarred face twisted with guilt and anger. His partner, his brother, was going to prison because of him, because Jesse had protected him in the bargain with Tanner. I should have gone with him, Red Eye said hoarsely. Should have surrendered too. No, William said firmly. Jesse made his choice and you need to respect it. What you need to do now is stay here, work hard, and be ready to help when he gets out. Because he will get out, and when he does, he'll need friends and a future waiting for him. It was the spring of 1879 when Jesse went on trial in Santa Fe. The courtroom was packed with spectators. Locals who'd been robbed, reporters from newspapers throughout the West, curious onlookers who wanted to see the notorious Hawk Thornton in person. Eleanor sat in the front row every day of the trial, wearing her best dress, holding her head high despite the whispers and stares. William sat beside her, his presence a silent declaration of support that spoke volumes in a society that valued family loyalty above almost everything else. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Jesse's lawyer, a sharp young attorney from Denver named Daniel Morrison whom William had hired, didn't deny the robberies. Instead, he focused on Jesse's lack of violence, his code of honor, his attempts at redemption, and the circumstances that had driven him to outlawry in the first place. Gentlemen of the jury, Morrison said in his closing argument, you've heard testimony about Jesse Thornton's crimes. They're real, they're serious, and my client doesn't deny them. But you've also heard about the boy who lost everything in the Civil War, who learned violence as a means of survival, who carried those lessons into adulthood because he knew nothing else. And you've heard about the man who's trying to change, who surrendered peacefully, who's worked honestly for 4 months on Mr. Blackwood's ranch. The question before you isn't whether Jesse Thornton was an outlaw, he was. The question is whether he can be something else, whether he deserves a chance at redemption. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a Mexican shopkeeper named Rodriguez who'd been robbed twice by other outlaws, read the verdict with a steady voice. We find the defendant guilty of 6 counts of stagecoach robbery. However, he paused, looking at Jesse. We recommend leniency based on his cooperation and lack of violence. The judge, a stern man named Harrington who'd presided over hundreds of cases, considered the verdict for a long moment before pronouncing sentence. Jesse Thornton, you've been found guilty of serious crimes against the people of this territory. Normally, such crimes would warrant 10 to 20 years in the territorial prison. However, given your age, your lack of prior violent offenses, and your cooperation with the court, I'm sentencing you to 5 years hard labor, with possibility of parole after 3 years for good behavior. May God have mercy on your soul. 5 years. Could have been worse, much worse. Men had been hanged for less than what Jesse had done. But 5 years was still an eternity, especially in the brutal conditions of a territorial prison where disease, violence, and despair killed as many men as old age. Eleanor met Jesse's eyes across the courtroom, and in that look passed 1,000 unspoken promises. She would wait. She would be there when he got out. Their love would survive this, just as it had survived everything else the world had thrown at it. As guards led Jesse away in chains, Eleanor finally allowed herself to collapse into her father's arms, crying for the man she loved and the years they would lose to punishment and penance. But she didn't give up hope. Hope, she'd learned, was the strongest thing in the world, stronger than law, stronger than prison walls, stronger even than time itself. The New Mexico Territorial Prison was a grim fortress of adobe and stone, located in the desert south of Santa Fe. It housed 200 inmates in conditions that ranged from harsh to inhumane. Men packed into cells designed for half their number, working 12-hour days in the quarry or on chain gangs, subsisting on beans, cornbread, and occasional strips of tough beef that might have been from cattle or horses. No one asked too many questions. Jesse Thornton, prisoner 847, spent his first months learning the brutal hierarchy of prison life. He kept his head down, did his work without complaint, and avoided the gangs and factions that controlled various aspects of prison life. His reputation as Hawk Thornton gave him some protection. Even in prison, men respected a famous outlaw, but it also made him a target for those looking to make their own reputations. 3 months into his sentence, a massive brute named Sullivan decided to test Jesse's reputation. Sullivan was serving a life sentence for murder, had nothing to lose, and liked to establish dominance through violence. The attack came during work detail in the quarry. Sullivan swung a pickaxe at Jesse's head, intending to split his skull like firewood. But 8 years of surviving as an outlaw had given Jesse reflexes that prison hadn't dulled. He dodged, caught the pickaxe handle, and drove his fist into Sullivan's throat hard enough to drop the man gasping to his knees. The guards broke it up before it could escalate further, but word spread quickly. Hawk Thornton wasn't soft, wasn't afraid, and wasn't someone to be crossed. After that, inmates gave him a wide berth, and Jesse was able to serve his time in relative peace. Eleanor visited every month, riding from the Doubleby Ranch with an armed escort, usually Red Eye, who'd become both her protector and her friend. These visits were the highlights of Jesse's existence. Brief hours where they could sit across a rough table in the visiting room and pretend they were anywhere else, anyone else. "How are the students?" Jesse would ask, hungry for details of the outside world, for proof that life continued beyond these walls. "Wonderful," Eleanor would reply, her eyes bright despite the sadness that never quite left them. "Little Hawk is reading at a 6th grade level now, though he's only 8. Maria wants to become a teacher like me. Thomas is brilliant with mathematics. I think he might become an engineer someday. And Red Eye. He's become quite the horseman. Father made him foreman of the braking operation. He's gentler with the animals than anyone expected, and they trust him." She smiled. "He asks about you every day, Jesse. He misses you terribly. I miss him too. I miss everyone. But mostly," Jesse reached across the table to take her hand, ignoring the guard's warning look. "I miss you. Every morning I wake up in that cell and for just a second I forget where I am. I think I'm going to roll over and see you beside me. Then reality comes crashing back." 3 years, Eleanor said firmly. "You'll be eligible for parole in 3 years if you maintain good behavior. Father's lawyers are already preparing the case. We're going to bring you home, Jesse. I promise you that. You've already done so much, waited so long. Eleanor, if you wanted to move on, to find someone else." "Don't," she interrupted sharply. "Don't you dare tell me to give up on us. I chose you, Jesse Thornton, and I'm not some weak-willed girl who changes her mind when things get difficult. We're going to survive this. We're going to have our life together. Do you understand me?" Jesse felt tears prick his eyes, something he hadn't allowed himself since entering prison. "I understand. God, I love you. And I love you. Now tell me what you've been reading." William Blackwood had arranged for Jesse to receive books, carefully selected volumes that the prison authorities deemed appropriate. Jesse had worked his way through everything from Shakespeare to Mark Twain, had studied history and philosophy and science, had educated himself in ways he'd never had the opportunity to during his rough childhood. The books became his salvation, his escape from the grinding brutality of prison life. When he read, he could be anywhere, anyone. A scholar in ancient Rome, an explorer charting unknown territories, a philosopher pondering the nature of existence. The words on the page were freedom, even if his body remained caged. Eleanor brought new books each visit, carefully chosen to challenge his mind and feed his soul. She also brought news from the outside world, how the West was changing, how railroads were connecting once isolated towns, how new technologies were transforming daily life. In 1879, Thomas Edison was perfecting his electric light bulb, which would revolutionize how people lived and worked. The first telephone lines were being strung between cities, allowing instant voice communication across vast distances. The Indian Wars were winding down as Native American tribes were forced onto reservations, their traditional ways of life destroyed by the relentless expansion of white settlement. The West Jesse had known, wild, lawless, full of possibility and danger, was disappearing, replaced by something more civilized but perhaps less free. Towns that had been rough settlements when he'd started his outlaw career were now proper cities with schools, churches, theaters, and electric streetlights. The frontier was closing, and with it, the era of the gunfighter and the outlaw was ending. "Maybe that's fitting," Jesse said during one visit, after Eleanor had told him about the changes sweeping through the territory. "Maybe men like me belong to the past. The world doesn't need outlaws anymore. It needs builders, workers, people who create instead of destroy." "Then that's what you'll be," Eleanor said. "When you get out, you'll help build the future instead of fighting the past. You're smart, capable, and you've learned from your mistakes. You can be anything you want to be, Jesse." The months crawled by. Jesse worked, read, survived. He saw men die from disease, from violence, from simple despair. He saw others released, walking out the prison gates into freedom with a mixture of joy and terror on their faces. He counted days like a miser counts coins, treasuring each one that brought him closer to parole, closer to Eleanor, closer to the life they'd promised each other. Red Eye visited too, though less frequently than Eleanor. The big man looked uncomfortable in the visiting room, his scarred face twisted with guilt that Jesse was in prison while he remained free. "You shouldn't have protected me," Red Eye said during one visit. "Should have let Tanner take us both. Then we'd both be in here, and Eleanor would be visiting 2 prisoners instead of 1, Jesse replied. "You're doing exactly what I need you to do. You're living the life we both dreamed about, proving that men like us can change. When I get out, I'll join you in that life. But someone had to go first, had to show it was possible. That's you, Red Eye. You're my proof that redemption isn't just a dream. Still feels wrong. I know. But brother, you've got to let it go. You've got to forgive yourself for surviving. Promise me that." Red Eye was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll try. But Hawk, when you get out, things are going to be different. I'm going to make sure you never regret protecting me. I'm going to help you build something so good, so solid, that all this," he gestured at the prison walls, "will seem like it was worth it." "It already is," Jesse said, "because it led me to Eleanor and to the chance at a real life. That's worth any price." The second year was harder than the first. The novelty of prison had worn off, replaced by grinding routine and crushing monotony. Jesse watched the seasons change through the narrow window of his cell, spring rains giving way to summer heat fading into autumn cool freezing into winter cold. He celebrated his 29th birthday in prison. His 30th. He wondered if he'd reach 35, 40, 50. He wondered what kind of man he'd be when he finally walked free, whether prison would break something essential in him or forge him into something stronger. Eleanor sustained him. Her monthly visits were lights in the darkness, proof that the world outside still existed, that love still mattered, that he had something to live for beyond mere survival. She brought him drawings from her students, crude but heartfelt pictures of horses and sunsets and families, and he tacked them to the wall of his cell, creating a gallery of hope. William Blackwood visited occasionally too, usually to update Jesse on the legal strategy for his parole hearing. The old cattle baron had spent thousands of dollars on lawyers and legal fees, had called in favors from politicians and judges, had used every ounce of his considerable influence to create a path for Jesse's early release. "Why?" Jesse asked during one such visit. "Why spend so much on a man who's nothing to you except the outlaw who took your daughter?" William smiled, a rare expression on his stern face. "You're not nothing to me, son. You're the man my daughter loves, which makes you family. And I protect family no matter what it costs. Besides," his smile faded, "I see in you what I was at your age, A man who'd made mistakes but had the capacity to be better. I got my second chance when Catherine's family finally accepted me. I'm giving you yours. I won't waste it, Jesse promised. I swear to you, Mr. Blackwood, I'll spend the rest of my life proving I was worth saving. See that you do. Eleanor sacrificed too much for you to fail her now. The third year, Jesse was transferred to a lower security section of the prison, reserved for inmates who demonstrated good behavior and were nearing parole eligibility. Here, conditions were marginally better. Smaller cells, longer visiting hours, access to a small library and workshop where prisoners could learn trades. Jesse learned carpentry from an old convict named Martinez, who'd killed a man in a bar fight 30 years ago and had spent half his life in prison. Martinez taught him how to measure and cut lumber, how to join pieces with dovetails and mortise and tenon joints, how to sand and finish wood until it glowed like honey. This is honest work, Martinez said, running his weathered hand over a table they'd built together. Work that creates instead of destroys. When you get out, young man, you remember this: your hands can build as easily as they can destroy. The choice is always yours. Jesse took those words to heart. In the prison workshop, he built a hope chest for Eleanor, a beautiful piece of furniture made from pine and cedar, with brass hinges and a lock that he carved himself. Inside, he placed letters he'd written but never sent, poems he'd composed during long sleepless nights, and a small wooden heart he'd carved with both their initials intertwined. When Eleanor saw it during her next visit, she cried, not from sadness but from overwhelming joy. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Jesse, this is the most wonderful thing anyone's ever made for me." "Fill it with dreams," Jesse said. "When I get out, we'll unpack those dreams together and make them real." The parole hearing was scheduled for June 15, 1882, exactly 3 years after Jesse had entered prison. William Blackwood's lawyers had prepared extensively, gathering character references from prison guards, letters of support from prominent citizens, who'd been carefully lobbied and compensated for their endorsements, and testimony about Jesse's rehabilitation. Eleanor wore her best dress to the hearing, deep green that matched her eyes, and sat beside her father as Jesse was brought before the parole board. The board consisted of 5 men: the territorial governor, 2 judges, the prison warden, and a representative from the railroad companies that had been Jesse's primary victims. They questioned him for 2 hours, probing his crimes, his remorse, his plans for the future. Jesse answered honestly, without excuses or self-pity. "I was an outlaw because I chose to be," he said. "The war gave me the skills and the hardness, but the choice was mine. I robbed stagecoaches because it was easy and exciting, and because I'd convinced myself that stealing from corporations wasn't really hurting anyone. I was wrong. Every robbery created fear, caused hardship for the workers I threatened, and contributed to lawlessness in the territory. I'm deeply sorry for that." "And if we release you?" the governor asked. "What then? How do we know you won't go back to your old ways?" "Because I have something now I didn't have before, a reason to be better. I have Eleanor, who's waited 3 years for me. I have William Blackwood, who's given me a chance at legitimate work. I have friends and a future that doesn't involve looking over my shoulder or sleeping with a gun under my pillow. I'd be a fool to throw that away, and prison has taught me many things, but foolishness isn't one of them." The board deliberated for an hour. When they returned, the governor read their decision in a formal tone that gave away nothing until the final word. "Mr. Thornton, this board has carefully considered your case, your record of behavior while incarcerated, and the considerable support you've received from prominent members of our community. We are prepared to grant you parole, effective immediately, under the following conditions. You will remain in New Mexico Territory for a period of 5 years, during which you will report monthly to a parole officer. You will maintain steady employment and commit no criminal acts of any kind. You will make restitution to the railroad companies you robbed, in an amount and on a schedule to be determined by this board. Do you accept these terms?" "I accept," Jesse said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "Don't thank us yet, Mr. Thornton. The hard part is just beginning. Parole is conditional freedom. One mistake and you'll be back behind these walls for the remainder of your sentence. Don't waste this chance." "I won't, sir. You have my word." When the shackles came off, when Jesse walked out of the prison gates into the bright New Mexico sunshine with Eleanor running toward him, tears streaming down both their faces, when he held her in his arms for the first time in 3 years, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heart beating against his chest, Jesse Thornton understood what redemption truly meant. It wasn't about forgiveness or forgetting. It was about transformation, about becoming someone new while acknowledging who you'd been. It was about taking the broken pieces of your past and forging them into something beautiful for the future. "Welcome home," Eleanor whispered against his chest. "Welcome home, Jesse." And for the first time in his adult life, Jesse Thornton truly felt like he was home. The wedding took place on a warm September evening in 1882, 3 months after Jesse's release from prison. It was a small affair, nothing like the grand society wedding Eleanor might have had if she'd chosen differently, held on the Doubleby Ranch under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. Father Miguel from the nearby mission performed the ceremony, speaking in both English and Spanish about love, sacrifice, and the redemptive power of forgiveness. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that she'd sewn herself, adorned with wildflowers from the ranch. Jesse wore new clothes that Red-Eye had bought for him, a white shirt, black vest and trousers that actually fit properly, unlike the rough prison garments he'd worn for 3 years. William Blackwood walked Eleanor down the aisle, really just a path between rows of wooden chairs where ranch hands and their families sat. His eyes were suspiciously wet as he placed his daughter's hand in Jesse's, and when he spoke, his voice was gruff with emotion. "Take care of her, son. She's the most precious thing in my world." "I will, sir. I promise you that." Red-Eye stood as Jesse's best man, his scarred face split by a rare smile. Mrs. Chun served as Eleanor's matron of honor, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief throughout the ceremony. Jesse's students, now Eleanor's students as Jesse had begun helping at the schoolhouse, threw flower petals as the newlyweds walked back down the aisle. The celebration that followed was everything a frontier wedding should be. Roasted beef from the Doubleby's cattle, fresh bread from Mrs. Chen's bakery, music played on fiddles and guitars by ranch hands who'd learned their songs from 3 different cultures. People danced until their feet hurt, drank whiskey and wine until their heads spun, and celebrated love's triumph over adversity. Late in the evening as the party continued around them, Jesse and Eleanor slipped away to their cabin, the same 2-room structure where they'd lived before his imprisonment, but improved now with new furniture Jesse had built in the prison workshop, curtains Eleanor had sewn during lonely nights waiting for his return, and books they'd collected together. "Mrs. Thornton," Jesse said, testing the name. "Eleanor Thornton. It sounds right." "It sounds perfect," Eleanor agreed, kissing him. "Though I may keep Blackwood professionally for teaching. Some parents are still uncomfortable with my colorful past. Let them be uncomfortable. You're the best teacher in the territory and they know it." They made love that night with the tenderness of people who'd been apart too long, who'd survived impossible circumstances, who understood that every moment together was a gift. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, they talked about the future with the eagerness of children planning a great adventure. "I want children," Eleanor said. "At least 3. Maybe 4. "A house full," Jesse agreed. "Boys and girls who grow up knowing they're loved, who never have to fight in wars or go hungry or wonder if they matter. I want to expand the school, hire more teachers. The territory is growing, and education is falling behind. Children deserve better. I want to earn enough to buy our own ranch someday. Not as big as your father's, but ours, built with our own hands and sweat. A place where people like Red-Eye and me, people who've made mistakes, can find work and redemption." "The Second Chance Ranch," Eleanor suggested. "I like that. The Second Chance Ranch where everyone gets the opportunity to start over." They dreamed until dawn painted the sky with pink and gold, until the roosters crowed and the ranch came alive with the sounds of a new day. And when they finally rose to begin their married life together, Jesse Thornton, former outlaw, ex-convict and now husband, felt a contentment he'd never imagined possible. The work was hard. Jesse spent long days on the ranch, learning every aspect of the cattle business from William Blackwood, who proved to be a demanding but fair teacher. He learned about breeding stock, about range management, about the economics of getting cattle to market. He learned to read weather patterns and grass conditions, to spot predators and disease, to manage men who tested him constantly because of his past. Some ranch hands resented working alongside a former outlaw. Others respected him for surviving prison and going straight. Jesse won them over slowly, through consistent hard work, through keeping his word, through demonstrating that he was committed to legitimate life no matter how difficult it became. Red-Eye remained his closest friend and ally. The big man had thrived during Jesse's imprisonment, rising from common ranch hand to foreman of the horse operation. Under his management, the Doubleby had developed a reputation for producing some of the finest working horses in the Southwest. Animals that were strong, intelligent, and reliable. Who'd have thought? Red-Eye said one evening as he and Jesse watched the sunset from the corral fence. 2 outlaws living honest lives, building something real. 5 years ago, if someone had told me this would be my future, I'd have laughed in their face. Would you go back? Jesse asked. If you could, would you choose the outlaw life again? Red-Eye thought carefully before answering. No. This is harder in some ways. The work's backbreaking, the pay's regular but not exciting, and nobody's going to write dime novels about Red-Eye McGraw, horsebreaker. But it's real, Hawk. When I go to bed at night, I'm not wondering if tomorrow's the day I get shot or hung. I'm just living. And that's enough. More than enough, Jesse agreed. It's everything. Eleanor's school continued to grow. She now had 47 students, ranging from 6 to 16 years old, representing every culture and background in the territory. She'd hired an assistant teacher, a young Mexican woman named Rosa who'd been one of her first students and had blossomed under Eleanor's mentorship. Together they taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, science, and music. They organized debates and spelling bees and science fairs. They created a small library with books donated by Eleanor's father and other wealthy patrons who'd been convinced that education was worth supporting. They proved that frontier children were just as capable of learning as their eastern counterparts, if only someone would take the time to teach them properly. Eleanor's reputation grew beyond Santa Fe. Newspapers wrote articles about the cattle baron's daughter who'd married an outlaw and was now revolutionizing education in the territory. Some praised her courage and innovation. Others condemned her continued association with Jesse, viewing her as a fallen woman who'd never fully rehabilitated her reputation. Eleanor didn't care. She had her students, her husband, her work, and her father's support. What strangers thought of her choices mattered not at all. In the summer of 1883, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news filled their cabin with joy. Jesse hooped and spun her around until she laughed and demanded he put her down, and that evening they celebrated with Red-Eye and William and Mrs. Chin, toasting the future with good wine and better company. A grandchild, William said, his usually stern face soft with anticipation. Catherine, I wish you could see this. Our daughter, happy and loved, starting a family of her own. Jesse felt a lump in his throat. He'd never known his own father as an adult. James Thornton Sr. had been hanged when Jesse was 14, and William Blackwood had become a father figure in ways Jesse hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. Thank you, Jesse said quietly to William after the others had left. For everything. For giving me a chance when no one else would. For supporting Eleanor when she chose me. For treating me like family instead of like the outlaw who stole your daughter. You didn't steal her, William replied. She gave herself freely, and that's the difference. Jesse, you've proven yourself 100 times over these past 2 years. You're a good man, not perfect but good, and that's all I ever wanted for Eleanor. Someone who'd love her, protect her, work hard to give her a good life. You've done all that and more. I'm going to do even better, Jesse promised. I'm going to give our child everything I never had. A stable home, both parents alive and present, education, opportunity, love. This baby's going to grow up knowing they're safe and valued and free to become whoever they want to be. I believe you, William said. And I'm proud of you, son. Truly proud. Those words meant more to Jesse than any treasure he'd ever stolen, more than any reputation he'd earned as an outlaw. To be called son by William Blackwood, to have earned the respect and pride of a man he admired, that was redemption in its purest form. The baby, a girl they named Catherine Rose, after Eleanor's mother and the wild roses that grew across the ranch, was born on a snowy February morning in 1884. She had Jesse's gray eyes and Eleanor's auburn hair, and from the moment she drew her first breath and wailed her displeasure at the cold world, she owned her parents' hearts completely. Jesse held his daughter for the first time with hands that trembled, this man who'd handled guns without fear now terrified of dropping something so small and precious. She's perfect, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Eleanor, she's absolutely perfect. She's ours, Eleanor said, exhausted but radiant. Our daughter. Our future. They settled into the rhythms of new parenthood, sleepless nights and wonderful mornings, first smiles and first words, the endless wonder of watching a new person develop personality and preferences. Catherine was a serious baby, studying the world with intense gray eyes before breaking into smiles that lit up the room. Jesse proved to be a devoted father, taking Catherine with him on easy ranch chores in a sling Eleanor had made, singing her songs he remembered from his own childhood, reading to her from books even though she couldn't possibly understand the words yet. You're going to spoil her, Eleanor said, though she was smiling as she watched Jesse patiently explain the finer points of horse care to their 6-month-old daughter. That's my right as a father, Jesse replied. Besides, she needs to learn these things. She's going to be a rancher someday, maybe run this whole operation. Or a teacher. Or a doctor. Or anything else she wants to be. Or anything else she wants to be, Jesse agreed. The world's changing, Eleanor. By the time Catherine's grown, women will have opportunities we can't even imagine yet. He was right about the world changing. By 1884, the West was almost unrecognizable from the frontier Jesse had known as a young outlaw. Railroads connected every major town, bringing manufactured goods from the east and taking cattle and minerals back. Telegraph lines allowed instant communication across the continent. Towns that had been lawless settlements were now cities with electric lights, telephones, and modern conveniences. The era of the gunfighter and outlaw was ending. Billy the Kid had been shot dead by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. Jesse James had been killed by his own gang member in 1882. The Dalton gang would meet their end in a botched bank robbery in 1892. The Wild West was being tamed, civilized, turned into something safer but perhaps less free. Jesse didn't mourn its passing. He'd lived that life and knew its costs. The constant fear, the violence, the impossibility of building anything lasting. He was grateful to be part of the new West, the one where men built instead of destroyed, where laws actually meant something, where children could grow up without witnessing gunfights in the streets. But the past had a way of catching up with you. Marshall Augustus Tanner returned to the Doubleby Ranch in the spring of 1885, riding his black stallion and looking older than his 48 years. Jesse saw him coming from the horse corral and felt his blood run cold. He'd been living honestly for nearly 4 years, had violated none of his parole conditions, had done everything required of him. But seeing Tanner brought back memories of prison, of feeling trapped and helpless, of years stolen from his life. Eleanor emerged from the cabin with Catherine on her hip, saw Tanner, and immediately moved to stand beside Jesse. United, they faced the marshal who'd arrested Jesse nearly 6 years ago. "Marshal Tanner," Jesse said carefully, "what brings you back to the Doubleby?" Tanner dismounted, and Jesse noticed the man was limping, an old injury that hadn't healed properly. The marshal looked tired, worn down by years of chasing outlaws through harsh country, of violence and death and all the ugliness that came with law enforcement on the frontier. "I came to talk to you, Thornton. Mind if we take a walk?" Jesse glanced at Eleanor, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "All right. Let me tell Mr. Blackwood I'm stepping away." They walked toward the north pasture, where cattle grazed peacefully under the spring sun. Tanner was quiet for a long time, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I'm retiring," he said finally. "After 20 years as a U.S. Marshal, I'm hanging up my badge. I'm tired, Thornton. Tired of chasing bad men through bad country, tired of the violence, tired of seeing young men throw their lives away for foolishness. I want to sit on a porch somewhere and watch the sun set without wondering if someone's going to shoot me in the back." "Congratulations," Jesse said, genuinely meaning it. "You've earned your rest, Marshal." "Maybe. I've done a lot of things I'm proud of and a few I'm not. But I came here today because I owed you something, an apology." Jesse stopped walking, stunned. "An apology? For what?" "For being so rigid, so unforgiving. When I arrested you, all I saw was an outlaw who needed to be punished. I didn't see a man capable of change, didn't believe in redemption or second chances. But I was wrong." Tanner gestured at the ranch around them. "You've proven that people can change, that punishment can lead to rehabilitation instead of just more violence. You've built a good life here, Thornton. A wife, a daughter, honest work, that's worth more than any arrest I ever made. I appreciate that, Marshal. But you don't owe me an apology. You were doing your job enforcing the law. I was guilty of the crimes you arrested me for." "True. But the law isn't always just, and justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about giving people room to grow, to become better than they were. Your parole agreement ends next year, 1886. When it does, your record will be cleared, your debt to society fully paid. You'll be a free man in every sense, Thornton. Use that freedom well." They shook hands, an outlaw and a lawman, past enemies finding common ground in the realization that life was more complicated than any simple morality tale. "One more thing," Tanner said as he turned to leave. "Your friend McGraw Red-Eye. His crimes were never officially prosecuted. As far as federal law is concerned, he's still wanted. But I'm not going to pursue it, and I'm going to recommend that my replacement doesn't either. The man's been living honest for 6 years. That's punishment enough in my book." After Tanner left, Jesse stood in the pasture for a long time, watching the cattle and thinking about redemption, about how the world could surprise you with mercy when you least expected it. When he finally returned to the cabin, Eleanor was waiting on the porch with Catherine. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Better than all right," Jesse said, scooping up his daughter and spinning her until she giggled. "Everything's perfect." The old man finished his story as the sun set over the ghost town of Lincoln County, painting the ruins of the San Miguel Mission in shades of gold and crimson. He poured another glass of whiskey for himself and his listener, a young reporter from back east, come to New Mexico to write about the legends of the Wild West. "So that's the story," the old man said. "The story of Jesse Hawk Thornton and Eleanor Blackwood, the outlaw and the schoolteacher who found each other in the middle of hell itself and refused to let go." "What happened after?" the reporter asked eagerly. "Did Jesse stay reformed? Did they live happily ever after?" The old man smiled, his weathered face creasing with memories. Jesse Thornton bought his own ranch in 1890, the Second Chance Ranch, just like he and Eleanor had dreamed. He and Red Eye ran it together for 40 years, taking in men who needed work and didn't care about pasts, only futures. Eleanor's school became the best in the territory, educated hundreds of children who went on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, ranchers, good people who made the West better than it had been. Catherine Rose Thornton became a doctor, one of the first female physicians in New Mexico. She married a good man, had 4 children, and lived to be 93 years old. Jesse and Eleanor had 2 more children after Catherine, twin boys named William and James, after their grandfathers. The family prospered, grew, became part of the fabric of New Mexico. Jesse lived to be 78. He died in 1930 in his sleep, in the house he'd built with his own hands, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who loved him. Eleanor held his hand as he passed, whispering the same words she'd said to him 52 years earlier. "I love you, Jesse Thornton. I'll see you again someday." "And Eleanor?" the reporter asked softly. "She outlived him by 8 years. Kept teaching until she was 75, kept fighting for education and justice and all the things she believed in. When she died in 1938 at 84 years old, they buried her next to Jesse on a hill overlooking the Second Chance Ranch. Their gravestone reads, 'Here lie Jesse and Eleanor Thornton, who proved that love is stronger than law, more enduring than time, and more powerful than any force that tries to destroy it.'" The old man stood up, his joints creaking with age. "The West you read about in dime novels and see in picture shows, that wasn't all there was to the frontier. For every gunfight, there were 1,000 quiet acts of courage. For every outlaw, there was someone trying to be better than their circumstances. For every tragedy, there was a love story that survived against impossible odds. Jesse and Eleanor's story isn't unique. All across the West, people found each other in unlikely circumstances, built lives out of nothing, created futures from the ashes of their pasts. That's what the frontier really was, not a place of endless violence and chaos, but a place where people could remake themselves, where love could flourish in the harshest conditions, where second chances were possible if you were brave enough to take them." "You seem to know an awful lot about Jesse and Eleanor," the reporter observed, studying the old man's face. "Did you know them personally?" The old man smiled and touched the scar above his right eye, a scar that left it permanently bloodshot, giving him a fierce appearance that belied his gentle nature. "I'm Thomas Red Eye McGraw's son. I was there for all of it, the robberies, the chase, the redemption. Jesse was my brother in everything but blood, and Eleanor was the sister I never had. They gave me the second chance I needed, and I spent 50 years trying to be worthy of it. Now I'm 90 years old, the last one left who remembers those wild days. Everyone else is gone. Jesse, Eleanor, William Blackwood, Marshall Tanner, even most of my own children. I'm the keeper of their story now, and I tell it to anyone who'll listen because people need to know. They need to understand that love really can conquer anything if you're willing to fight for it." The reporter sat in silence, absorbing the story, understanding that he'd stumbled onto something rare and precious, a first-hand account from someone who'd lived through the legend. "What's the most important thing you learned from Jesse and Eleanor?" the reporter asked finally. Red Eye poured one last glass of whiskey, held it up to catch the fading light. "That redemption is always possible if you want it badly enough. That love is worth any sacrifice. That the choices we make define us more than the circumstances we're born into. And that some loves, the real ones, the ones that change everything, those loves simply refuse to die no matter what the world throws at them." He drank the whiskey in one swallow, then set down the glass with finality. "Now get out of here, young man. Write your story. Tell the world about Jesse Hawk Thornton and Eleanor Blackwood, about an outlaw and a schoolteacher who found forever in the middle of chaos. Tell them that the Wild West wasn't just about whiskey and gunpowder, though there was plenty of both. It was about people brave enough to love when love seemed impossible, to hope when hope seemed foolish, to build when everything around them was burning down. Tell them that story. Because in the end, that's the only story that really matters. The story of love that couldn't die no matter how hard the world tried to kill it. As the reporter rode away into the gathering darkness, Red-Eye McGraw stood alone in the ruins of the old mission, remembering. He thought about his brother Jesse, about Eleanor's fierce green eyes, about a time when the West was wild and anything seemed possible. He thought about second chances and redemption and the power of love to transform even the most broken souls. And as the stars emerged one by one in the vast New Mexico sky, Red-Eye raised his weathered face to the heavens and whispered a prayer of thanksgiving for the life he'd lived, the friends he'd loved, and the story he'd been privileged to witness. The Wild West was gone now, vanished like morning mist in the desert sun. But the love between Jesse and Eleanor Thornton remained, immortal as legend, strong as the mountains, enduring as the stars themselves. Some loves really are too powerful for death to claim. Some loves truly never die.